Call this meeting to order. Bienvenue au Comité Sénatorial Permanent des Affaires.
Welcome to the Standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology.
From Toronto and chairman of the committee, and I would ask the other members of our committee today to introduce themselves, and I'll start over on my right side.
Judith Siegman from Montreal, Quebec, and Deputy Chair of the Committee.
Carolyn Stewart-Olson, New Brunswick.
Rosemary Poirier, Nouveau-Brunswick.
Nancy Green-Rain from BC.
Thank you.
Wanda Thomas-Bernard from Nova Scotia.
Fabien Manning, Newfoundland Labrador.
Marie-Françoise Lévy, de Quebec.
Jim Munson, my heart is in New Brunswick, but I'm an Ontario Senator.
Ratna Omidvar, Toronto.
Chantal Petitclerc du Québec.
And we continue today with our hearings with respect to Bill C45, an act respecting cannabis and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts. Particularly today, we are focusing in two panels on the subject of home cultivation, or the four plants issue, as is part of the bill that is before us. On this first panel, we have representing the Canadian Real Estate Association, Michael Bourque, Chief Executive Officer, Randall McCauley, who is Vice President, Government and Public Relations. And from Anandia Labs, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, okay, Jonathan Page, who's the Chief Executive Officer. And by video conference, you can see on the screen that we have the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, Deputy Chief Constable Mike Serr, Co-Chair of Drug Advisory Committee. And we have from the Vancouver Police Department, Inspector Bill Spurn. And then from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Ernest Small, who is Principal Research Science and Technology Branch of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So we go on this particular panel between now and 4 o'clock, some 2 hours. And let me start as they are listed on our agenda for today, and that is to ask for opening comments, first from Michael Bourque, Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Real Estate Association. I would ask all of our opening presentations to be no more than 7 minutes, please. And Michael Bourque.
Thank you, Senator Eggleton. The Canadian Real Estate Association represents over 125,000 realtors across the country. However, we're here today on behalf of home buyers, property owners, and their tenants. Bill C45 will not directly harm realtors, but it will impact their customers. I will focus on one particular element of the bill, the cultivation of cannabis in dwellings, homes, and apartments. Indoor cultivation can cause damage that will result in increased expenses, especially for landlords who will then have to pass on these costs to tenants. This will raise rents for Canadians and will disproportionately impact lower income Canadians. The stated purpose of the bill is to protect public health and public safety, and yet the legislation ignores evidence that growing cannabis indoors can be hazardous to the home and health of homeowners. Last month, an agency funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada released a report confirming that indoor cultivation and processing of cannabis can introduce and exacerbate environmental health risks in a home. And just 2 weeks ago, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities singled out personal cultivation of cannabis as the most problematic issue towns and cities will face following the passage of this legislation. In fact, municipalities have struggled for years with major problems caused by the legal home cultivation of marijuana for medicinal purposes. The legislation will allow individuals to grow 4 plants in the home. On the surface, this sounds moderate, but the legislation doesn't limit the number of crops or the size of each plant. With proper irrigation and lighting, an individual could grow very large plants and harvest 3 or 4 crops a year. Yields could reach over 5 kilograms a year. At that level of production, 4 plants have the potential to cause damage to a dwelling with associated health consequences to residents. Health Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation both place indoor air quality as one of the most important elements to maintaining a healthy home. The federal government is spending millions of dollars researching indoor air quality, building, and construction standards. Yet the documented risks associated with increased levels of mold, spores, and fungus when growing cannabis indoors seem to have been ignored in the proposed legislation. Exposure to mold and fungus can cause a range of respiratory diseases. Senators need to consider the impact and hardship to people living in housing units in proximity to air pollution from this activity. Contamination from pesticides and fertilizers can lead to further issues with air quality, and these chemicals can also pose a risk to children. How many thousands of apartments have shared ventilation systems? Many realtors have witnessed firsthand the damage done to homes where cannabis has been cultivated without adequate ventilation or appropriate electrical infrastructure. Improper installation and the use of grow-op equipment, including high wattage lights and irrigation, pose safety risks. Growing 4 large plants in a room with heat from lights and excess moisture without adequate ventilation creates risks. I hope you will also hear from fire chiefs like Surrey's Len Garris, as many have been vocal about the consequences, including fatalities, they have witnessed from these hazards. We question if personal cultivation is even necessary. Canada has the production capacity to deal with new demand for recreational cannabis thanks to a well-funded, well-capitalized cannabis industry. The company operating in Smiths Falls, Ontario, the former Hershey chocolate factory, is now employing more people than Hershey ever did. After legalization, most Canadians will have ready access to cannabis that has been grown in safe conditions, in stores and online. Arguably, there will be no clear need to grow your own. Senators could reduce the risks associated with the legalization of home cultivation with a simple amendment to Part 1, Division 1, stating that, notwithstanding anything to the contrary in this Act, an individual is prohibited from cultivating, propagating, or harvesting any cannabis plants in a dwelling house until the Governor and Council, by order, declares that the province in which the dwelling house is situated has adopted codes and standards for cultivation, propagation, and harvesting of cannabis plants in a dwelling house. In other words, you need regulation prior to the implementation of home grow. This would be a prudent and responsible approach, one that respects the rights of provinces and allows the ultimate intent of the Act. The federal government should also provide a framework available to provinces, territories, and municipalities on regulations and guidelines for the safe home cultivation of cannabis. These guidelines would be based on evidence and designed to mitigate the hazards that are already being experienced. If the purpose is to protect public health and public safety, then these provisions need to be in place before home cultivation is permitted. Canadians voted for the legalization of cannabis, but it is a huge undertaking. I ask you to consider the interests of people, young and old, who will be affected by home cultivation. What problem does home growing solve? And yet, how many problems does it create? If we're going to legalize cannabis, we need to roll this out, pardon the pun, I couldn't resist, in a careful, sensible way that will protect vulnerable Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I go on to Anandia Labs. Jonathan Page, Chief Executive Officer.
Mr. Chairman, it is an honor to speak today on the important topic of cannabis legalization. I'm a scientist who has studied the cannabis plant and its chemistry and biochemistry since 1999. I'm currently an adjunct professor in the botany department at the University of British Columbia and the CEO of a cannabis testing and biotechnology company called Anandia Labs. I want to specifically address the subject of personal cultivation or home growing. This is clearly one of the most controversial aspects of Bill C45, and it is important to discuss these concerns in light of the present state of knowledge about the cannabis plant. Before I turn to the science, I'd like to state that I think it is fundamentally important that cannabis legalization includes the ability to grow the plant itself. The cultivation of plants is a foundational aspect of human culture. The advent of agriculture via the cultivation of plants and the planting of seeds is one of the key forces in the creation of human societies. Humans continue to have an innate urge to grow plants, as is now apparent as we Canadians emerge from our winter hibernation and return to our gardens. Cannabis has been grown by humans for thousands of years and has served as a source of food, fiber, and drug. Given this long-standing relationship and the fact that we are legalizing use by adults, it seems untenable that we could contemplate legalization without allowing personal cultivation. Imagine being able to buy a tomato at the grocery store, but being prevented by law from growing one yourself. Some senators and witnesses are concerned that our cities will be overrun by dangerous cannabis gardens. Others worry that cannabis plants in homes are dangerous for children. I think these concerns are misplaced and can be reduced by a better understanding of the risks involved. One point is that children cannot get high from deliberately or inadvertently eating cannabis plants. Cannabis does not contain the drug THC, but rather its precursor, THC acid, which itself is non-psychoactive. Cannabis needs to be smoked or heated, for example in baking brownies, to convert THC acid to THC. What this means is that a toddler accidentally nibbling a cannabis leaf will not become intoxicated. Even this is highly unlikely since cannabis is not sweet or colorful and actually quite unpalatable. A second point is that the cannabinoids, such as THC, are not volatile at room temperature. Although the plant can have a strong smell, that smell is due to chemicals called terpenes and not cannabinoids such as THC. It is impossible for children or adults to become intoxicated just by breathing the air near cannabis plants. Allergic reactions to cannabis are infrequent and not serious. Although it is not easy to grow well, cannabis is not a special plant. The water, light, and space needed for growing up to 4 cannabis plants in a private dwelling or a backyard are not more than a regular houseplant, and they are not cause for concern. The smell of cannabis, which arguably is one of the more difficult issues around its cultivation, can be mitigated by proper ventilation or air filtration. Our homes contain many products that can harm children and youth. Brightly colored laundry pods, solvents, alcohol in unlocked cupboards and refrigerators, leftover painkillers in medicine cabinets. We already grow toxic plants such as philodendron, foxglove, and yew, but by these standards, cannabis is not a safety concern. Will personal cultivation make cannabis more available to teenagers? This seems to be an area where drug education of our youth and parental supervision are better solutions rather than an outright ban on personal growing. The risks here are no different than those contemplated for cannabis purchased by adults and then stored in their homes. I will also point out that it is unlikely that many Canadians will actually grow their own cannabis. I read the testimony of one witness to this committee last week who said that a 100-unit high-rise could contain 400 cannabis plants under the proposed legislation. While perhaps factually correct, I think this is an exaggeration. Canadians can produce their own beer and wine at home, and they can grow tobacco for personal use as well, but the vast majority buy these products from stores. Similarly, most people will purchase cannabis rather than growing it, and it seems unlikely that homegrown cannabis will enter the black market on a large scale. The retail system, which is robust and growing, as the previous witness stated, that the provinces are now implementing will mean that cannabis is widely available for purchase. Although Bill C45 is silent on whether outdoor cultivation should be permitted for personal or commercial production, I will add that I think it is important that it is included, or at least not excluded by an amendment. There are significant environmental costs to indoor production, including electricity usage. This is more on the commercial than personal scale. Outdoor production can mitigate some of these problems and should be considered as an option. For small-scale personal cultivation, careful placement of 4 plants out of view of neighbors is a simple and reasonable security measure. For larger commercial production, I am sure that Health Canada will mandate sufficient security requirements to protect outdoor crops from theft and diversion. I note that the majority of cannabis grown by the U.S. government for research purposes at the University of Mississippi is grown outside. In conclusion, personal cultivation is an important aspect of legalization that enables our basic human connection to the plant world. I speak for both the plant and for gardeners when I say legalization without personal cultivation included is a half measure. The exclusion of outdoor cultivation for personal use and at commercial scale is also unnecessary. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Thank you very much. Next, we go to the video screens and welcome the first of two that will come to us on video. And that would be Deputy Chief Constable Mike Serr, who is co-chair of the Drug Advisory Committee, speaking on behalf of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police.
Good afternoon and thank you. Distinguished members of this committee, by way of introduction again, I'm Deputy Chief Mike Serr of the Abbotsford Police Department and Chair of the CACP Drug Advisory Committee. We are pleased to be given this opportunity to meet with you today and to discuss Bill C45. The mandate of the CACP is safety and security for all Canadians through innovative police leadership. The mandate is accomplished through the activities of special projects and some 20 CACP committees, and through active liaison with various levels of government. Ensuring the safety of our citizens and our communities is central to the mission of our membership and their police services. In terms of Bill C45 and C46, our role from the beginning has been to share our expertise with the government to help mitigate the impact of this legislation on public safety. Extensive discussions with the CACP membership and various committees form the basis of our advice. We participated in a number of government-held consultations and provided submissions to the Federal Task Force. We produced 2 discussion papers entitled CACP Recommendations of the Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulations on February 8, 2017, and Government Introduces Legislation to Legalize Cannabis on April 28, 2017. We have appeared and provided written submissions to the House of Commons and Senate committees on both C45 and C46. This is our 5th committee appearance on the issue of the legalization of cannabis. While police leaders across Canada have identified a number of major themes which impact policing resulting from legalization, we continue to strongly advocate against in-home production and in-home possession aspects of this legislation. With regards to in-home production, our members are of the view that realistically, we do not have the capacity to enforce nor determine what is illicit and licit cannabis. Additionally, it will provide for additional opportunities for illegal possession, distribution, and overproduction of cannabis. Also, we fear that it will pose further risk to youth due to increased exposure and accessibility. The cultivation of 4 plants is being greatly underappreciated. There are many variables. However, typically, each plant can produce approximately 1 to 3 ounces of cannabis 4 times yearly. This amounts to a potential cultivation of 48 ounces per home per year, assuming that the legal limits are adhered to. Moreover, unlike the 30-gram possession of cannabis outside a dwelling, Bill C45 remains silent on the quantity of cannabis permissible indoors. At this time, possession in a dwelling is virtually unlimited, thereby making it difficult to determine whether the cannabis is derived from a lawful or unlawful source, or whether the amount of possession is in fact for the purpose of distribution. Given these issues, we recommend that a limitation on in possession be imposed. The Government of Canada, when this legislation was introduced, was very purposeful in stating that the goal was to legalize, strictly regulate, and restrict access to cannabis in Canada. When it comes to personal cultivation and in-home possession, it appears that this goal has been overlooked. Certain provinces have indicated that they will apply further restrictions in this area. Other stakeholders with expertise in health and real estate sectors, for example, have also indicated concerns. The CACP is recommending that the Government of Canada adhere to one of the strongest messages which came out of Colorado, the Colorado experience with legalization, that being to take a slow and incremental approach and to continuously review and assess as time goes on. Let us catch our wind, and when legalization becomes a reality, and agree to review in-home cultivation at a later date. In conclusion, our recommendations are not intended to dispute the government's intention of restricting, regulating, and legalizing cannabis use in Canada. Instead, we raise these issues because we have concerns about the impact of this act, and as previously stated, we all have a responsibility to mitigate the impact on public safety, which is our primary goal from a policing perspective. The CACP supports many of the overall goals of this act, while recognizing that other stakeholders are better equipped to provide specialized knowledge in their areas of expertise. We also support efforts to deter and reduce criminal activity by imposing serious penalties for those breaking the law, especially those who import and export cannabis and those that sell cannabis to our youth. Sincere thanks are extended to all members of this committee for allowing the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police the opportunity to offer comments and suggestions on Bill C45. We also look forward to answering your questions. Merci.
Thank you very much. In addition to hearing from the Chiefs Association, we wanted to also hear from a police department that would be involved in dealing with this thing on a street-by-street, community-by-community basis. And so we've also invited the Vancouver Police Department, and they're both in Vancouver, as it turns out, so they're both sharing this screen. So next is Inspector Bill Spurn.
Thank you. Distinguished members of this committee, by way of introduction, I'm Inspector Bill Spurn of the Vancouver Police Department's Organized Crime Section. I'm also a member of the CACP Drug Advisory Committee. On behalf of the Vancouver Police Department's Chief Constable Adam Palmer, I would like to thank you for inviting me here today. I am pleased to have the opportunity to meet with you, provide information about our concerns in relation to Bill C45, and answer any questions. Being mindful of the committee's time, I'll be brief. The Vancouver Police Department is preparing for the legalization of recreational cannabis. We have participated in a number of consultations and expressed our concerns to different levels of government. We support the CACP's recommendations outlined in the two papers highlighted by Deputy Chief Serr, and our concerns are the same as those of the CACP. In the local context, one of our primary concerns with Bill C45 continues to be home production. Permitting production within a residence goes against the objectives of creating a regulated environment where priorities such as limiting youth access and deterring a black market should be paramount. If we use our experience with medical cannabis production as a baseline indicator, overproduction will be an ongoing issue within a legalized recreational regime. We believe that home production will result in an increase in calls for service concerning odor, overproduction, fire, flooding, and landlord and tenant disputes. We expect an increase in the number of oil extraction operations that utilize solvents to remove oils from cannabis plants and are highly explosive. We also believe that home production will result in an increased number of property and violent crimes. Having cannabis available to purchase inside government-approved stores and supplied by licensed producers without allowing home production would be our preferred approach. Home production could then be reviewed at a later time. We support the CACP's recommendation for a cannabis possession limit within a dwelling house. Any limit should be reasonable and well-defined to make a stronger distinction between personal possession and possession for distribution. Without reasonable possession limits inside a dwelling house, it will be difficult to identify and seize illicit cannabis. This could result in indemnification issues and place law enforcement in jeopardy. In conclusion, the concerns of the Vancouver Police Department highlight some of the impacts we believe this bill will have on public safety. Thank you to the members of this committee for allowing me to speak, and I look forward to answering any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you, and we'll get back to you when the questions start coming your way. Finally, we have from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Dr. Ernest Small, who's Principal Research Scientist, Science and Technology Branch for the department. Dr. Small?
I'm honored to appear before this committee as it studies Bill C45, Cannabis Act. In the next few minutes, I propose to briefly review my studies of cannabis on behalf of the Science and Technology Branch of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I began my employment with Agriculture Canada in 1969 as an agricultural crop scientist. For almost half a century now, one of my specialties has been the cannabis plant, the species known as Cannabis sativa. This includes two basic classes of plants, plants with very low amounts of the intoxicating chemical tetrahydrocannabinol, known as THC, are grown either for fiber from the stems or for their edible oil seed and are collectively known as hemp. Plants with very high amounts of THC are called marijuana plants, and of course they are used to produce the drug preparation called marijuana. The word cannabis is often used in a generic sense to refer to marijuana, and many advocates of the medical use of the drug think it's more polite to talk about medical cannabis than medical marijuana, but it is really the same thing. During my career, I have authored about 400 scientific reports, including 15 books. My latest book is a review in reasonably simple language of all aspects of cannabis science. This is available online in the Federal Science Library. By the late 1960s, society had become polarized about the wisdom of marijuana prohibition, and the Parliament of Canada established the Ledane Commission of Inquiry into the Non-Medical Use of Drugs with a particular mandate to assess marijuana. In 1970, I was seconded half-time to provide botanical advice on cannabis to the Commission and to prepare an extensive report on its agricultural aspects. I want to acknowledge the tremendous support over the last several decades by Health Canada, which financially supported numerous of my studies on cannabis. In 1970, Health and Welfare Canada, subsequently divided in part into Health Canada, established a long-term joint, excuse that, program of research with AAFC into cannabis to be conducted by me in association with chemists at Health Canada. The goal of these studies was to obtain basic scientific knowledge in order to base legislation on a sound footing. Because marijuana has been a prohibited, albeit popular drug for many years, authorized scientific research has been limited, and a great deal of misinformation was in circulation. In its wisdom, the Government of Canada has supported targeted research for decades. Starting in 1971, I grew hundreds of different varieties, both hemp and marijuana, on a central experimental farm, and these were analyzed chemically. This research established clearly that many varieties of the cannabis plant have insignificant amounts of THC and can be grown without fear that they will be utilized as a narcotic. Conversely, many varieties have large amounts of THC, and of course, these have been favored for illicit purposes and in more recent times for medical usage. I propose that low THC varieties with less than 0.3% THC be defined as a class of plants that can be considered for legal cultivation. Because their THC is too low to merit concern, to my great satisfaction, this criterion has been employed in numerous countries, including Canada, as the basis for allowing hemp cultivars to be grown. In 1997, after about 60 years of prohibition, Bill C8, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, was amended, allowing Canadian farmers to grow hemp. Prior to the re-legalization of hemp cultivation, the rationale for Agriculture Canada's participation in cannabis research was to assist the Government of Canada, particularly Health Canada and Justice Canada, in conducting research on the harmfulness and control of cannabis. With the resumption of hemp cultivation, a mandate was added to assist the expanding hemp industry to develop, supported by both Agriculture Canada and Health Canada. Several contracts between Health Canada and the private sector supported hemp-oriented research that I conducted. For example, with the support of Health Canada, I was able to establish storage conditions to maintain hemp seeds in a viable condition for many years. In return, I have been a member of Health Canada committees, formulating and modifying regulations controlling hemp cultivation in Canada and annually reviewing cultivars that are allowed to be grown. Similarly, our sister organization, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, has been responsible for conducting hemp purity trials to maintain hemp variety quality, and for years I have assisted them in this activity. Notably, several contracts with private sector companies have also supported collaborative hemp research with Agriculture Canada. The activities summarized here have contributed significantly to Canada becoming the world leader in developing hemp as an oilseed industry. In 2001, the Marijuana Medical Access Regulations provided medical marijuana to Canadians. The main way patients could obtain medical marijuana was to purchase dried material from a private company, Prairie Plant Systems, which had contracted with Health Canada. A cooperative project between the firm and Agriculture Canada, conducted by me, was key to establishing a production system for 12 years until 2013. A marijuana strain I selected was the standard form of medical marijuana in Canada. It was used by about 100,000 patients. Until 2013, I was tasked with maintaining a reserve of seeds of the standard medical strain on behalf of Health Canada. Finally, I would like to emphasize that I and my many colleagues at Agriculture Canada have expertise that can contribute to the safe and efficient implementation of government policies concerning marijuana. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That completes the speakers list, and now we'll get into questions from members of the committee. And again, we'll operate on the basis of 5 minutes, which covers both questions and answers. So it would be best if you directed your question to a specific panelist or two, whatever. And I notice Mr. McCauley is here with Mr. Bourque to answer for the Canadian Real Estate Association. Please direct your question. That way you'll get more in your 5 minutes rather than getting everybody to answer, which could take up the whole 5 minutes. Okay, and with that, let me start with the Deputy Chairs. I'll start with Senatrice Petitclerc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
My questions to our guest on the screen in Vancouver, Mr. Spurn and Constable Serr. I would like, you both have touched it at different angle, but I'm trying, before we dig into that home production topic, to get a sense of the scale of things and the scale of those risks or challenges, because from some witnesses sometimes we hear that it's going to be pretty minimal, like just not that big of challenges, and then we get the total amount, the total opposite, that it's going to be very, very challenging. So I'm trying to. I would like to hear you in terms of your experience, maybe what you know from international experience, what we know from the medicinal experience already in place, what we should expect in terms of scale and in terms of challenges, in particular for you in terms of monitoring.
So I'll start off, and in regards to the medical regulations, we have consistently across Canada seen overproduction and diversion of the product with persons who have licenses to grow medically. So certainly a challenge for us. In regards to the 4 plants, I think one of the challenges for us is capacity. Certainly as this starts to unroll the legislation, our focus as law enforcement will be on organized crime. Certainly we are very engaged with the opioid crisis. So managing catching persons who may be overproducing, say for example 6 plants or 7 plants, will be challenging for law enforcement to be engaged in those types of investigations. So the capacity for us to be able to do that is going to be a challenge. And I guess maybe the third point I'll raise is youth and diversion to youth. What we know from Colorado State is that 45% of youth were able to get their cannabis through a person, an adult who obtained it legally. 22% was from a parent. So of course some of that is from a store, but also some of that is from diversion of product that was grown. So from our perspective, we certainly want to protect the youth. So and then I guess another final issue would be, we have continued concerns about that there's no limits to the amount that can be held within a private residence. That's a lot of marijuana, as we said, 12 ounces every 3 months to 4 months is a significant amount and exceeds what a typical heavy user would use in that period of time. So then our question would be, where would the excess cannabis be directed to? Because there certainly is, unless it's stored properly, a shelf life to that. I'll pass on to Inspector Spurn.
Just to add what Deputy Chief Serr has already spoken about, I'll try not to repeat, but recently the Vancouver Police Department had a few of our members go down to Seattle and liaise with members of that police department just to get an idea of some of the challenges that they faced back in since 2012 with their implementation of recreational cannabis down there. And some of the things that they've run into since that time is obviously an increase in large-scale marijuana grow operations, an increase of street-level trafficking, and this is due to the disparity of a black market price versus a regulated price. Obviously, they've also run into an increase in the number of these oil extraction labs that I talked about, which are dangerous and explosive, and an increase in impaired driving. So, as well as increased break and enters, armed robberies, and other property crimes that revolve around cannabis. So that'll give you an idea. I think you asked about what other jurisdictions are facing that already have recreational cannabis that's legal.
Thank you. Do I still have time?
No, you've got just a little bit of time. Very quick question.
Well, I'll wait then.
Okay,
Merci.
we'll put you down for the second round. Okay, Senator Seidman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all very much for your presentation. I might start by addressing my question to Mr. Bourque. I'd like to tell you, and I'm sure you've heard, that some witnesses and experts have told us that we have nothing to worry about when it comes to cannabis home growing, because it amounts to little more than tending to a plant at home. And it's no different than a house plant. We've even heard that it's good therapy to grow plants. So 4 plants per household, on the face of it, mightn't sound so bad. And I understand that the bill places no limits on the size of the plants. So if you could perhaps paint a picture for us of what this might actually look like in a home. So you have 4 plants, what, in a small corner, or could it be in a whole room? How much, I think you alluded to how much 4 plants could actually produce in a year, but you might tell us again. And also, could 4 plants sustain a commercial grow operation?
Thanks. There's a lot of questions in there, so let me try and unwrap it a little bit. I think the amount that I said was 5 kilograms. That's based on growing plants very quickly, because you can use lights and fertilizer and grow them. There's no limit on the size of growth. It could be the size of me. It's not unusual for a plant to be that big. There's no limit to the width of it. What realtors have seen in homes is typically where there have been more than 4 plants grown, but as the Constable was saying, they won't have the resources to monitor whether somebody is growing 5, 6, 7 plants. So I think the point from a housing standpoint is that you're going to see damage to the home, and this might have been overlooked by a home inspector and then the second owner gets this house, and then the home inspector finds a problem, and you could devalue the house. And then the problem within a rental context is that shared ventilation systems, and where you're growing marijuana, you're going to smoke marijuana, and then you're going to create all kinds of problems. And I think that's reflected in the police suggesting that there's going to be many more service calls. What I think is important, though, is to really just address the mythology that seems to exist, that there's going to be a sort of benign approach to this, the sort of aging hippie who's growing their own plant, to smoke it. In BC, the BC Hydro folks found that there were 40,000 dwellings operating grow ops, and that's in an environment where it's illegal. And I think you can safely expect that people are going to take advantage of the fact that it's legal to grow plants, and they're going to do so in a way that isn't necessarily safe. So they'll have perhaps electrical problems and other things that will arise as a result of not knowing what they're doing. And, it really comes back to the government, was elected with a promise to legalize, but the fact is home growing is a whole different thing, and it unleashes all kinds of problems that have been identified. Some of them have been identified today, and yet I don't see the solution that it's providing.
I presume that in a multi-unit residential building, this would be an issue not only for condo owners, for example, but also for apartment, for landlords who rent apartments.
Well, I think what would happen is it's not a stretch to suggest that landlords who have rental buildings will try to convert those to condominiums where they can have more control over what goes on within the building, and then that will decrease the rental stock, which is already in places like Vancouver and Toronto at a premium, and there are more Canadians who are lower income that rent than own, and so they are disproportionately affected by these kinds of policies.
Okay, do I have any more time?
Well, you got half a minute.
Okay, I might just, if I could just move over to the police chiefs for one moment, and then on my second round, I'm going to come back at you if I could. But you talked about this being unenforceable. And, we're just hearing now about what we could find in a home or in multi-unit buildings. So could you just speak quickly, and then I hope to come back to it, about what you meant in more detail?
So very briefly, as far as a priority for us to attend, if we were to receive information that someone was growing 5 plants or 6 plants versus the legal 4, where that would be a priority for law enforcement, and certainly as legalization unrolls, we have a lot of other priorities, and namely organized crime and more of the larger scale. So for the most part, it would be a low priority call for law enforcement, and it would be very resource intensive as well. So I'll leave it at that and await your next question.
Okay. Let me move on. By the way, if on any of these questions, any of the other panelists wants to weigh in, please signal to me. And it depends on the time that's left in the senator's time frame and whether the senator wants to work you into that time frame. But signal to me and I will bring it to the attention of the senator, if you know what I mean. And from that, we'll go to Senator Munson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here, and anyone can answer this this question. There seems to be a mild case of reefer madness hysteria taking place. But in any case, in the Tobacco Act, a person can cultivate up to 15 kilograms of tobacco at home. And but who do we know that does that much? In the country today, there must be tens of thousands of places who are growing marijuana in their homes illegally. So I'm curious about how do you address this issue? It hasn't seemed to cause a major concern before, unless I'm missing something, of police swooping in on 4 plants, 6 plants, 8 plants, or whatever. And also, if you take a look at the Tobacco Act and the exemption, it's manufacturing for personal use. That goes on everywhere across this country, and yet we don't hear that much outrage and hysteria saying, please don't grow tobacco in my 100-unit apartment building because I could get sick as well. So I'd like to have some kind of balance in terms of approaching this issue, if anybody would care to address it.
Okay, that's openly to anybody in the panel who wants to start. Mr. McCauley and then Mr. Page.
Thanks for the question, Senator. I think one of the differences, or one of the primary differences, first of all, the availability of tobacco. I think despite recent efforts to crack down on it, tobacco is very readily available everywhere. There's no need to grow it at home. And I would submit the same would likely happen with marijuana, given there's a fundamental difference in Canada versus many other jurisdictions that have legalized marijuana, including most of them in the States. In Canada, it will be available by mail. It will be available, the provinces will make it available, and where it's not available by the provinces, you can go online and the federal government will make it available. So home delivery, you have to keep in mind, in Colorado and those other states, doesn't exist. In fact, the Colorado Senate just voted it down. So Canada, unlike any other jurisdiction, should have an ample supply of available marijuana to everyone who wants it. So why would you go through or want to risk the potential consequences of growing it in home, where your possession, I think the possession limit when you're transporting it on yourself is 30 grams, and there's no limit in your house. So all the marijuana you could possibly need will be made available by the provincial and federal governments without any of the attendant risk or confusion outlined by the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, Realtors, Home Inspectors, Appraisals. I mean, the list goes on. So I think that's one of the fundamental reasons we see that this does not solve any problems, yet potentially creates many.
Mr. Page?
I was going to respond to that, and also the questions around how big a space are we actually talking about here. I mean, tobacco plants can get quite large. Cannabis plants can get quite large as well. But in general, on a commercial setting, we're talking about one plant per 1.5 foot. So, in the area that I'm sitting here, this would be the area suitable for 4 plants. And they might, in terms of, I think people are going to 5 kilos annually with like maximum capacity, not a sort of corner of an apartment or the patio of someone's condo. It's, these are like the largest cannabis plants in the world could generate that kind of volume of material. Dr. Small referred to Prairie Plant Systems earlier. This was the commercial producer in Saskatoon that had the contract for so many years. I think they were about 30 grams per plant on average per harvest. So, it's not a huge amount of material. It's not bales of cannabis that are being produced. And in terms of the moisture, I mean, you can have, Norfolk pines to the ceiling in your apartment. You can have ficus. You can have other plants. And, you water those plants every day and they're generating moisture. It's not particularly damaging to the house or to the patio. Obviously we could plant a fir tree in an apartment and it would be damaging, but that's not what we're talking about with cannabis. I think as well, what we're hearing from the law enforcement representatives is a very important description of the world that they've been working in for a number of years, where we've had a black market in cannabis and there has been overgrow from cannabis. Canada's medical cannabis producers, in some instances, supplying a black market. And I think what we have to think about with Bill C45 is we're trying to close that off. We're going to have a legal supply. The idea that basements and garages and barns are going to be filled with these illicit grow ops, and we can extrapolate the sort of problems with mold and moisture and smell and the rest of it to this very small, limited 4-plant limit, is not realizing that legalization is happening and prohibition will soon be over.
Okay, that's the time. Second round, yes, Senatrice Meiji.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais poser la question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be asking this question in French, if I may. Mr. Page, do we really need pesticides and fertilizer to grow homegrown indoor plants? Could you hear the interpretation? Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
The use of those materials for cultivation indoors. Yes, all plants need fertilizers. That can be simple, garden, store, soil with the fertilizer that's already there. It could be, organic fertilizer from your compost. It could be chemical fertilizer in some situations. In terms of pesticide use, there's no requirement to use pesticides for cannabis. In fact, the current medical cannabis regulations and the licensed producers who grow under those regulations are prohibited from using the majority of chemical pesticides. There's a 20 or so benign pesticides that they can use. So you absolutely don't need pesticides to successfully grow cannabis.
Thank you. I have a further question.
Senator, or do you want to ask another question?
Peut-être s'il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui pourrait.
If anyone wants to add anything, please go ahead.
I'd like to add to that, actually, because I think, again, this relates to the mythology of the benign producer versus the person who has other intent. Perhaps we're not creating a black market, but we're going to create a very large gray market for cannabis, because you would be allowed to grow, and even though maybe the average would be small plants, you can grow very large plants, and you can do it as quickly as possible. I mean, if you look at the experience of Canadian farmers in just about every crop in Canada, the fact is the science allows you to grow these record crops, and it's thanks to fertilizers and other science that are enabling people to grow very rapidly. And as much as, what we've argued for is an amendment that would put regulations in place before we allow home growing. So if you had proper regulations, then maybe you could limit to some of these smaller plants less frequently, and you could do that in consultation with law enforcement and others. But what we're seeing is there's a whole bunch of, and we have a list, we'd be happy to table it, that has about 19 organizations, and I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list of organizations that are scared of the repercussions of home growing because of the people who will grow it, who will allow their product to enter the gray market. And since anybody who's over the age of 25 will be able to grow it legally, then this leads to people who are underage having access to the product.
OK. Merci, mais je pourrais vous garder encore, M. Bourque.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bourque. Now, as far as sharing of ventilation systems is concerned in apartment blocks or in a duplex, it was my understanding before the legalization that was referred to that were one to sell, cultivate or grow marijuana in one home, it would be hard to sell the home because the value of the home would drop if a buyer was actually found. So in addition to that, there's the ventilation issue. So you've proposed an amendment to the legislation which would allow homegrown marijuana and home cultivation. What does it look like for the future for owners? Response: it's already a problem for owners, and it's going to be a problem for the tenants as well, because, well, the tenants are entitled to grow marijuana and to smoke marijuana, and it's going to be even harder to stop something that is going to be legal going forward. And the legislation will enable tenants and renters and to smoke, and the air quality will certainly not be improved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Poirier.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here and for your presentation. My first question is for Monsieur Bourque from the Canadian Real Estate Association. In your presentation, you talked about the problems of possible indoor quality of air. You talked about respiratory disease. You talked about mold, spores, fungus, and different things like that that could affect the home. Can you share with us shortly what a short-term or long-term consequence to a house structure would be if they would have that type of air quality of mold, spores, and fungus, how it affects the home?
Thanks for the question. Well, first of all, I'm not a scientist, but we've done our homework on this, and we've looked at what experts have been saying. We also have the benefit of the experience of tens of thousands of realtors who've been in these properties where there have been grow-ops. And, you know, for years, the police have familiarity with drug labs that are in homes that are much worse than just marijuana cultivation, where you end up with sewer damage, where you have all kinds of molds and potentially explosions from the precursors that are being used to make drugs. And so, you know, realtors have had long experience dealing with these kinds of properties. It's not very difficult to find someone in the real estate business who has personally encountered a home that has been affected because people have grown large quantities, have not done so properly. They rewire to the panel in an unsafe way. This creates fire hazards. They don't have proper ventilation. There is a lot of humidity. Often they're hiding this growing, so they'll have it in a closed-off room or they'll have it in the basement. And you know, a good realtor will ensure that there's an inspector brought in and a thorough inspection done in a home, and that's usually where they'll find the problem.
Just to add on to that, and I know others want to respond. And
Senator, Mr. Page also wanted to respond.
I just want to add something to it, and then if you can please respond, I would appreciate it. What would be the impact, or do you feel that there would be an impact to the evaluation of the home? And also, we start hearing just lately, more on my local team, local end of the province, I've started hearing some insurance companies are saying that they fear that they could increase the cost of the insurance, to the point that I had one actually that mentioned to me that their insurance company said that they may even make that a question when you go to insure your home, is are you growing within your home, and that could affect the, so if you can comment on that, and then if the other people who would want to comment on the first or second part of the question, I would appreciate it too. Thanks.
There's absolutely no question that it impacts the value of the home. And you're right that there are insurance companies and there's mortgage insurance companies that are saying, hey, we want to know if somebody has been growing, and now they're in a quandary because if it's grown legally, you know, what are their rights? So they have a lot of concerns as well.
Just, if I could echo that, Senator, what we've seen with our members is that because there are no remediation standards, either in provinces or across the country, in terms of what to do once you've discovered mold or fungus growing in the home, what we've seen is mortgage insurers are reluctant to offer insurance on that property, and financial institutions are reluctant to lend money against that property. So what you've effectively done is taken that home off the market until you can do, we've seen remediations from ripping all the walls down to the studs to make sure that you've gotten rid of all the mold for the home to be palatable to those institutions to willing to put it back on the market. And you've seen the evidence from BC Hydro, heard the evidence about 40,000 grow-ops while it's illegal. Who knows what's going to happen when it's legal, but when you take homes off the market, that creates secondary and tertiary problems in terms of the availability of properties as well.
I think what we're hearing here, though, are facts and figures, if I could call them that, based on large-scale commercial illicit grow-ops. When I hear the term grow-op, that does not describe the limited four-plant personal cultivation as contemplated in this bill. And in terms of moisture, I mean, you know, having a shower without the fan on in a basement over a period of time will probably put more moisture into a home than four plants that are just watered judiciously in regular pots. I mean, my house has more than that 9 square feet of just regular orchids that my wife really likes. And in terms of the moisture coming out of those plants, I'm sure that boiling a pot of spaghetti in the kitchen is generating more moisture. So I don't think we can fearmonger based on some of the horror stories around illicit grow-ops when we're talking about four-plant limit personal cultivation.
Okay, no, I have to move on. Senator But the second round, Senator Stuart Olson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to go over the safety of the plants themselves, if you don't mind, and this will be for Dr. Small. You mentioned that you had been developing many of the cannabis plants, et cetera. Now, years ago, the marijuana that you would buy on the streets was nowhere near, I'm told, nowhere near the strength that it is today. And I'm wondering, with the home grow operations, I mean, do you have to have a special seed to grow those extra strong plants, or is it the method of extraction? And how freely, what it comes down to is then you have a whole bunch of plants that are producing very strong, a very strong drug. And I worry that this will not protect Canadians. There are no quality controls over what's being grown in the homes. And should that be distributed outside the homes or even to the people in the homes? So I'm just wondering about how you safely grow plants, and should that be something the government should get into teaching people, because they're saying, go ahead, it's all fine.
You've asked a very broad question, and I know I'm required to answer briefly. I find it a little difficult to accept that at this time the Government of Canada is going to issue a manual on how to grow cannabis for the average consumer, although, you know, maybe it isn't the worst idea in the world. I do think there are legitimate concerns, safety concerns, for growing cannabis indoors that relate to the question of mold production, and also the way that illicit cannabis is grown sometimes is rather unhealthy. I'll just leave it at that. In terms of strength, it is true that modern strains produce larger concentrations, larger amounts. It is also true that people have learned, and this is the case commercially, how to trim off the weaker parts so that the final product is quite concentrated, kind of like producing rye whiskey as opposed to beer. I also share, however, Dr. Page's basic philosophy that it's nice to allow people to grow plants, and excuse me for saying so, even though this is not your typical plant, it does provide an opportunity for many people to become amateur horticulturists, and it, in my opinion, can be done in a safe fashion. It also can be done in an unsafe fashion, as I think has been pointed out by several parties here. And from my point of perspective, I really can't predict what the present legislation would do in terms of safety considerations. To me, it's a bit of a gamble.
Thank you.
We've still got more time.
Thank you. I really want to get down to, though, what I perceive as a danger, and unforeseen danger perhaps, that people growing the plants in their homes will be producing varieties, and you can't help it. You just want to make it better, and you're cultivating the best, and you're growing the best. It's like people who do their own wine at home or their own beer. And I'm just going to be worried about how you manage to keep people safe with this kind of, and I think I am speculating, you're right, but you've managed in your development to keep people safe. You recommended the strains and the dosages for the medical marijuana. So how do you manage to keep, if people are growing their own, how do you manage to keep people safe?
Medical marijuana is produced with practices that are far more stringent than are possible by your home grower. For example, medical marijuana is commonly irradiated to remove microbiological contamination, safety issues. Commercial medical marijuana, and indeed this will be the case for recreational marijuana, is produced with careful attention to humidity so that mold possibilities are kept low. Also, you can control fertilizer. Even if you use pesticide, you can control your chemical inputs. That being said, for recreational marijuana, you're not necessarily talking about a population that is immune compromised and is much more susceptible. So one can, I think, only examine the general situation in Colorado, Washington, elsewhere, and as people are doing, and draw your own conclusions about the level of safety involved. I don't think there's a clear evaluation available at this time.
Thank you.
I have to move on. We've passed
Thank
that
you, Chair.
5-minute segment. Senator Rain.
Thank you all very much. The more I hear, the more questions I have. I'd like to ask Dr. Small, if you don't mind telling me, you say they're growing now a standard medical marijuana. What is the THC level of that?
The marijuana strain that I selected could be altered somewhat, but generally produced a THC concentration of around 12%. Now, the kinds of concentrations that are currently being reported by commercial medical marijuana suppliers is kind of artificial, because what's done is that the part of the plant that is highest in THC concentration, namely the flowering parts, are carefully often trimmed away so that the larger parts of the plant, the leaf-like parts, they're called bracts, which have lower THC concentrations, are trimmed away, artificially building up the THC level. And that's done because high THC concentration is a selling point in many marketplaces. People like the idea of growing something, of purchasing something that's stronger. It obviously is problematical in that respect.
If you don't mind me following up, I thought that what you were looking for in medical marijuana was a high CBD and low THC. So what would the CBD levels be in the standard medical marijuana?
Both THC and CBD have medical properties. There are indications that they are independently and collectively useful for certain medical conditions. In the main, the recreational market has gravitated very, very strongly to high THC levels and very low CBD levels. On the other hand, there is evidence that cutting down the THC level and building up the CBD level, in other words, having a kind of a hybrid product, has less potential for illness.
So actually, I guess one of the exciting things about the coming legalization of marijuana is the fact that there will be more research and doctors will be eventually comfortable in prescribing the different kinds of. So, but I guess.
An indication from Mr. Page.
Well,
if that's okay with the Senator.
I would like to, and then I've got one more question for both of you as well.
I'll respond really quickly on terms of percentages. You asked about where THC levels are in the current medical system, and my lab does a lot of that kind of testing. So it would or 27%, with really the average for THC strains around 17.5%, and that's been consistent since 2015. And then, as Dr. Small indicated, there's more and more CBD products and products that contain both. And CBD is typically topping out around 18% in a pure CBD strain. And there's things like 7 and 7 and 6 and 4 and those kind of mixes between THC and CBD.
Okay. Now, when you're, I think, I mean, there's a lot of concern out there of people smoking dried cannabis or dried marijuana and the harms that that can do to your lungs. So I would think that people will move once it's legal and once it's sort of produced and sold in other forms, that a year from now we're going to be looking at legalizing all kinds of different types of forms that are maybe not as harmful to your health. So I'm just wondering, I have a concern with it being grown and then you get into the production of oils and things like that, which is at this point quite problematic. So would you have any thought on where do you think it's going to go? I guess I don't know who I'd ask, maybe Mr. Page and Dr. Small.
Where's it going? Yeah, I mean, I think what we're going to see is over time a reduction in smoking and vaporizing, so inhalation as a route of consumption, and the emergence of ingestion, so via beverages or edible type products where people are not smoking. And you know, Bill C45 I think contemplates a 1-year period before the rollout of those non-smoke products, and I think this is a good step forward in terms of public health to have, not the reliance on inhalation. There are now oils available, ingestible oils as part of the medical system, and I assume we'll see those being part of the recreational system immediately, but they're not the sort of beverages and things that are kind of you see in Colorado and other places.
There is a lot of current interest in the role of these volatile compounds that were referred to earlier as terpenes. That's really what gives the smell to cannabis. The cannabinoids really don't have an odor. And commercial strains today are, yes, they are differentiated on percentages of THC and CBD, but often it's the terpenes that qualify a given strain as different and give it a certain image. And the role of the terpenes medically is currently, I would say, an exciting area of research with potential for medical applications. Not my area of specialization. And in Canada currently, compounding of cannabinoids and other medicinal ingredients, to my understanding, is not allowed. But one day, this will have to be demonstrated by research, of course. One day, that may open up an exciting new vista for applications. On the other hand, I recall reading a notice recently about terpenes also having possible harmful effects. So that one has to be careful here that terpenes, these basically odor taste components that differentiate strains, and really it's the only basis of the more than 1,000 strains that are being marketed one way or another around the world. Really it's the terpenes that are the critical ingredients. Whether they are harmful or beneficial, or harmful under some circumstances, beneficial under other circumstances, awaits research, but it is an interesting area.
So I just wanted, if you don't mind...
No, sorry, we're way over time. Senator Ahmedvar.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here. My first two questions are for the Real Estate Association, and if I have time, I'd like to move on to the representative of the police forces. Thank you, Mr. Bourque. You note in your brief that you speak for home buyers, property owners, their tenants, and customers. So in a sense, you're speaking for all Canadians in a way, because either we're home buyers, property owners, or tenants somewhere. And you've talked a number of times about the mythology around cannabis. So I'd like to put some evidence in front of you. The Task Force on Legalization and Regulation of Cannabis got 30,000 submissions. 92% responded that they were in favor of personal cultivation. And just recently, the National Cannabis Survey demonstrated that only 9% of Canadians either grow or get someone to grow it for them, and this is both recreational and medicinal. And I think we've heard the discussion around the difference between 4 plants and a grow-up. And 4 plants do not a grow-up make. I think we can all agree on that. And we're not looking at a Breaking Bad kind of scenario. So I'd like you to consider your comments again within the limitation of 4 plants or less in a home.
Thank you. I think the 4 plants itself is part of the mythology. The fact is that there is no size limit to that plant, and there is no limit to how many times I can grow that quickly. If I have nefarious goals in mind, then I will use whatever lighting, fertilizer, technology is available to grow those plants as quickly as possible so that I can grow as much as possible. And that will be legal. And so, there's no regulation currently around where I would grow that, what kind of ventilation. If I take the Health Canada's current regulations for medical growing, and we have copies of this that we can circulate in both languages, Mr. Chair, which is, these are the regulations. This is what you have to fill out in order to grow medical marijuana. So what we're suggesting is, listen, I completely understand the politics of people wanting to grow, but we're unleashing something without any regulation. And what we're suggesting is that regulation would help separate the mythology of the 4 plants from what would be something that is safe and less benign, and more benign, sorry.
That was very helpful. So you do support the development of regulations that are national or provincial in this matter? In
my remarks, I gave a specific amendment that senators could consider, which would essentially require provincial regulation before this part of the Act is enacted. And I think once those regulations are in place, then perhaps we could do this more safely. And coming back to the police, one of the things that they said they learned from Colorado is proceed slowly. And one of the lessons from Colorado is that they had a number of plants initially, and then they've reduced it. So why would we go through all this and make the same mistakes that they've already made? Let's just put some regulation in place first, and then proceed accordingly. We're already going to make legalization of marijuana, and therefore marijuana available all across Canada. This is a very big scale experiment, and on the plus side, legalization has the opportunity to remove organized crime, to provide education, to provide medical research, but it can also increase the gray market, increase access to kids, destroy property, and have negative health impacts on vulnerable populations. And I think we could mitigate all of those things if we regulated before we allowed people to grow at home.
Senator, I see a signal from Deputy Chief Serr, who would like to respond, if that's okay.
If it is, thank you. And we just want to reiterate what Mr. Bourque is saying, that it has been our experience over the years that people are continuously overproducing with medical grows. And again, as the Association of Chiefs of Police, we are saying that we are not saying never. We're saying allow the regulations, allow the legalization to unfold, allow us to better understand how the impacts will affect public safety, and then we can take an evidence-based approach on what we want to do next. Again, also, I think for plants is very subjective. We are seeing very large plants that are being produced, and plants that are typically producing much more than the average heavy user would consume on a regular basis. So there is going to be overproduction. That is a fact. And the fact is what will happen with that overproduction, I think, is critical. And as a law enforcement, we want to ensure that we're not seeing that overproduction.
Okay, next is Senator Bernard.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question that I want to ask the police officers, and it's one that's I've been thinking about for some time. We've heard many of the witnesses that have come before us use the term black market. I believe that the term black market sends a subliminal message which may contribute to unconscious bias in the criminalization of cannabis. So I'd like you to tell us, please, what do you mean by the term black market?
Thanks very much for the question. When we speak of the black market, what we're speaking about is cannabis that is produced outside of a legal regime. It's sold illegally. Specifically right now, if you want to buy your medical cannabis, there's a way to do it. And in Vancouver, we have over 100 stores operating right now that are being supplied by the black market, by overproduction in the medical marijuana scheme, because these stores are not getting their products from licensed producers that are licensed under Health Canada. So when we speak about the black market, we're talking about producers who are producing cannabis outside of any legal regime.
And maybe just to add, our experience from Washington State and Colorado is that approximately 30% of the product being purchased in those states is black market. Certainly that is a priority for the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, and one of the foundations of this legislation is to disrupt and hopefully down the road to reduce the black market supply. So that is a priority for us, and any ability we have to limit grows outside of the licensed producers will certainly assist us in managing the black market.
So should we be using the term black market, or should we be using the term illegal or illicit market? Is there an unconscious bias that seeps in to the use of the term black, and I put in quotation marks, market?
Yeah, I certainly think the term is, you're correct, Senator, that it is an illegal market. Anyone that purchases outside of that legal regime is purchasing illegal cannabis. The terminology I know is it varies. We typically have used in policing the black market, and in some cases gray market, depending on where it's purchased. But anyone that's purchasing outside of that regime, it's an illegal market.
Okay. Senator, what do you think? Okay.
I don't think that I don't think that my point is being understood.
Well, I think it was the last part, perhaps.
And it's not just the police, of course, that are using the term. Other people have used the term even here today, and it's been used consistently. And for the record, I think we should really look at the use of that term and how that term may be feeding into and has fed into the criminalization of black bodies. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll go on the second round, please.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Lankin.
Thank you. My first question is to Mr. Bourque. And let me say that I understand the concern of someone who owns a house and rents it out, or someone who owns a condo or an apartment and rents it out. That is your property, and you should have some say about what goes on and what could be potentially damaging, although I completely agree with the comments that have been made about there are lots of things that can be abused within a home that would create similar conditions. One of the things we know is whenever there's a law, there's people who will break the law. And I don't know that we legislate for the extreme. We legislate for the common person. Having said that, I'm very empathetic where it is a rental situation. Where it's a homeowner situation, maybe we need to look at regulations about what's included in what you must disclose. If you have a car accident and you sell your car, you've got to disclose it. You know, there are certain things. If you've got asbestos, you have to disclose it. So perhaps there's something there that we could look at. Similarly, I rent a condo in Ottawa. In the condo that I rent, in the contract I sign, there could be no smoking, tobacco smoking, any smoking, in the building at all or on the balcony. Other people I know live in places where cats and dogs aren't allowed. Is that a matter of regulation that provides for that, or is that a matter of the contract between the home or unit owner and the renter?
Well, one thing I can say for sure is that going forward, you'll see that clause in any sale agreement, because the purchaser, who's going to be protected by a realtor, is going to have a clause that says the seller certifies that this home was not used as a growing operation. One of the problems that you could run into with a legal limit that is this, large 4 plants, cultivated many times in a year, is that you could have damage anyway, but the person, what's their requirement to disclose if it's not really an illegal grow-op or not even classified as a grow-op? So we do get into a gray area. Also, it's easier for...
ask you to think that through just a little bit. It's legal for me to have a dog, unless in my province it's a pit bull. It is... Like we don't step in to regulate everything, but we create conditions, and contracts are one of the ways we regulate our relationships with each other. So what I'm asking, I'm actually really empathetic, and it's an interesting idea, your amendment, and I'm going to really give some consideration to it. But I'm wondering if it is necessary, because anything above 4 plants is illegal, and there are 40,000 in BC grow-ops, which are not 4 plants. There's lots of this going on now, and it is illegal, and there should be ways in which we have protection against that for homeowners renting, or for unit owners renting, or for purchasers buying a home in terms of what's going on there. Can that not be done through disclosure, contract provisions in your rental lease agreement? Does it have to be done by the government stepping in?
Well, one would hope so, that it could be done through a contract, but what I was painting was a scenario where the person who owned the home was growing 4 plants legally. Right now, there's no regulation. So all we know is it's 4 plants. It doesn't limit the size, and it doesn't limit the number of times that you can grow that, harvest it, and start growing more. So if you do that to the maximum of what's possible, and you do it in the wrong way, in a small space that's not properly ventilated, then you're not doing anything illegal, but you could be damaging the home. And therefore, you could sign a contract that says, I did not operate a grow-op, but you might still be damaging the home. So then you're putting the onus on the home inspector. And, home inspectors are trained to look at these things. But, we're introducing risk. At the same time, I would add that the government seems very concerned about the amount of debt that people are taking on to purchase their homes, and yet at the same time we're introducing something that would potentially damage a home. And there's been all kinds of new regulation that is making it harder for, in particular, first-time home buyers to access the market, and yet we're introducing an unregulated activity which could potentially damage the home. Now, when it comes to the renter, I think, again, you could have a contract, but it does open things up for legal challenges. If you're a landlord and the tenant makes the case that I'm doing something that's legal, why should I not be allowed to do it?
Having a dog?
Well, yeah, having a dog is maybe a little less dangerous, but it's the same kind of thing.
Apparently before they banned pit bulls it wasn't. Okay, second round please.
Okay, sure. To complete this round, Senator Gold.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, and I do apologize for having arrived late. And so if the question's been asked, please, I won't be offended if you say asked and answered. First, with regard to health concerns about home cultivation, I'd like to ask this of Drs. Page or Small. Is there a health risk for, say, a child consuming the buds or flowers of a plant at home? Could that child overdose or be harmed by eating parts of the raw plant? So this was something I raised in my opening remarks, but I could go over it again. It's a sort of a chemistry issue where the plant is actually making an inactive precursor of THC. It's making THC acid, which doesn't bind cannabinoid receptors and doesn't have the same ability to make you high or intoxicate. So you need to smoke that plant or cook it or heat it in some way to convert THC acid to THC. So a child nibbling on a cannabis flower, and as I also mentioned, they're quite unpalatable. It doesn't seem like something that's going to be very likely, will not get intoxicated from that ingestion.
With regard to home cultivation, perhaps I could ask this generally. We're a big country with sparse populations. If you live in the north, it's very expensive to buy anything. And we heard testimony by Senator Patterson before the Aboriginal People's Committee that up in Nunavut, dozens of communities, he's finding people paying over $50, sometimes $100 per gram, whereas we expect the street price in Ottawa or elsewhere legally to be 10 or less per gram. So do you see home cultivation as a remedy for people in rural and remote areas to have access to reasonably affordable regulated cannabis?
Do you want Dr. Page to start? You seem to be
Anybody
looking at him. I'm trying to see who you were looking at.
I can start.
So we'll start with him, and then we'll take up anybody else.
Yeah, I think that's a worthwhile sort of a solution. That one of the points raised earlier here was what kind of solution is home cultivation? There's no problem at solving if cannabis is widely available in retail stores, but in rural areas or northern communities where that's not the case, 4 plants in a well done small cultivation facility in someone's home could be a solution to high costs and lack of distribution. Yeah.
I'll add quickly that I think it's another argument for having regulation before you make this legal, because there may well be instances where, as a priority, you would want certain people because of access problems. I take the point that it's more expensive to ship things to the north, but it's also true that governments are going to supply these markets, and they're going to do that through Canada Post or some other way, and there may be ways that they can do that affordably. But it speaks to the need for rules.
Dr. Small?
Dr. Page has a comment first.
I just wanted to make the comment that we're not talking about a sort of an absence, a vacuum of regulations around home cultivation. The federal act provides the 4-plant cultivation, but the provinces are already enacting their own legislation. So Quebec has actually said no home cultivation, full stop. And Alberta has said cultivation only inside the home, no outdoor. And BC, just this last week, put legislation, it's not passed yet, but it would have significant fines for backyard plants that were visible from the street or from public areas. So it's not like we're talking about just a free-for-all within this case. Please.
In some northern communities, the very long light regime in the summer could be an advantage to growing certain strains. On the other hand, for the rest of the year, your heating costs would be probably prohibitive.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, let's go into round 2 now. We have 25 minutes. I've got 3, 6, 8 people on here. There's no way 5 minutes each will work. So I could either do 5 minutes and we'll see where it runs out, or I could do 3 minutes or 4 minutes, and you'd rather the smaller and try to get everybody in? Okay, we'll try that. So we'll start with Senator Seidman.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I'll try to be fast. I'm going to address my question to Constable Serr, I think it is. So it's about the personal possession issue, and actually I think Deputy Chief Constable Serr and also even Inspector Spurn, you both discussed this. So there's no limit on personal possession at home. And I'd like you to speak to that and give us a sense of what the consequences would be for law enforcement. And if there were a limit, what the maximum should be and why.
Thank you, Senator. And I'm really glad you brought up this question because it is very important to us. Right now, without any limits, somebody could hypothetically have, 10, 15, 20 kilograms of product in the residence. And without us being able to prove knowledge that it was for distribution or having any evidence to that effect, we're really challenged because they are allowed to have as much cannabis as they would like to have in that residence. Often we find that private dwellings are utilized as a spot where to transport illicit cannabis to other locations. So for us, we do have a concern with that. And there's also concern with what constitutes a dwelling. For another example, a person in a motorhome, perhaps, who's driving across the country, who has a very large volume of cannabis, where does that fall in? And that could be for, again, illicit purposes and us to prove. As far as your point to what would be a recommended level, one of the bases we've used that if 4 plants were still allowed, which we still are not in favor of, but if that was the case, on the high side, that could produce 48 ounces a year. So using that as a baseline as to perhaps what should be allowed. We are mindful that, like with alcohol, people will have more than what they need. But, like I said, a heavy user will typically use approximately 11 grams a week. So let's even go on the high side and say 50 grams a month to even push it. If you have 4 adults, 200 grams in a residence is a lot of cannabis, especially since there is a shelf life to cannabis if not stored properly. So it's very important for us, for law enforcement, to have limitations on what would be allowed in a private residence. And Inspector Spurn?
Yeah, I'll just echo what's already been said, that, rather than having things open-ended with no limit, I think that a reasonable amount that somebody can possess inside their home would be something that we would ask for, and it would solve a lot of issues with us in that we would be able to determine much easier what is illicit and what is legal.
And also, sorry, just to add very quickly, the diversion is really one of our priorities. And we do not want to see the product diverted. As we said, youth have typically had it diverted to them through these types of means of overproduction. So to try to give us more tools to address that.
Senatrice Petitclerc.
A short question for Mr. Page, because I was interested, you talked about and you described the risk to children, or the non-risk, really, of ingesting, or and then compared it with other elements in the house that will be more risky. So I just want to hear you, if you think, in regard with C45, if you feel that the bill, the way it is designed now, is sufficient in terms of safety and home production and safety to children, or would you feel that we need to add protection in terms of security?
Yeah, I think it is sufficient. However, I think with, we see this with Health Canada now on sort of education programs around like Tide Pods or something that, toddlers are chewing on, or not, teenagers were on YouTube talking about. But so I think it's sufficient with overlaid with a level of education that says, make sure you, especially with dried cannabis that probably would be purchased from a store, not cultivated, would be, stored appropriately like we would see with alcohol or prescription drugs.
Monsieur Bourque?
I just wanted to mention, because I did reference in my remarks the impact on children, I really wasn't speaking about, small children eating plants. I was referring to the smoke and air contaminants from fungus, mold that could occur, and in particular where there's a shared ventilation system in a building.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Munson.
Chair, two brief questions. First for the Realtors Association, Mr. Bourque. Just for the record, can you tell us what other groups that you interact with and how they feel about it? You alluded to some names, but just for the record, we need to know that. And I'll get this question so the police can think about it. When it comes to strongly advocating against in-home production, in-home possession aspects of legislation, and you talk about, given the issues, we recommend that a limitation on indoor possession be imposed. Simple question, how do you police that?
Start with, your first question was to...
It was about the list, so
yeah,
I'd be happy to table this list, but the ones that are close to us include the home and property inspectors, the apartment associations, the appraisal institute. So we've talked to all of the home folks, and they all have concerns, but it ranges, Medical Association, Pediatric Association, and Senator Lankin, I'm happy to report that the Canadian Veterinary Medicine Association also has concerns on behalf of animals.
Okay. On the second question, let's go to the Deputy Chief and Inspector.
So how this typically would probably come to our knowledge would be one of a couple ways. Is one, that we're there for another call, and then our members are able to identify or see a large volume of cannabis, which is over and above what they are entitled to have. Another one would be through obtaining some sort of information that somebody is storing large volumes of cannabis at a private residence, in which case we would then be looking to initiate an investigation. So really those would be probably the two most common ways in which it would come to our attention that someone has in excess of what they're entitled to for cannabis.
And the limitation would be what? We recommend a limitation on indoor possession. What is the limitation?
Yeah, we have not provided a number purposely because there are a lot of variables. As we said, if indoor cultivation is permitted, typically that would be approximately 12 ounces every 3 months. So there is sort of a foundation that I think the Senate could look at. If plants are not required, or allowed, I should say, like I said, a heavy consumer of cannabis would be in that range of 11 grams per week. So like I said, just using an average, let's even go to 50 grams for one adult user a month. Use that as a foundation for perhaps a house that has 3 or 4 adults in it, would be something that, and we understand there has to be a little bit of room in there for, we get the fact that there could be a party or something, and we certainly don't want to be, policing or having to oversee, small amounts that someone's over, but to find a reasonable amount that would be not consistent with somebody who's looking to divert a product into the illicit market.
Okay, thank you. Senatrice Mégy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm directing my question to the two representatives from the police forces. You said that some users, for medical purposes, often underproduce. But if there's no plaintiff, there's not going to be a complaint. How would you know which home or apartment to go to in order to investigate a potential offence?
I guess a lot of times that, when we attend these residences and we find marijuana being produced, the first thing we need to do is find out whether this is being produced under the medical system. And so that's how we usually run into these situations. Is we come into a residence, we find a marijuana grow op, and we would call Health Canada. They would tell us right away whether or not that is a legal medical grow.
Okay, Senatrice, that's it. Any other question?
C'était juste parce que
Well, the reason I asked the question is, how do you know where to go? At the outset, you said that you entered the premises, you see there's 4 plants, you contact Health Canada, but how do you know which apartment or residence to go to? Who tells you?
Again, there's multiple ways it would come to our attention that there may be an illegal grow operation. So one is through neighbors and complaints that we've received, and then through police officers doing additional investigation, they may obtain the facts and evidence that indicates that there is overproduction. Also, we do at times, we'll receive it on many occasions through information that we have been provided by persons that have seen an overproduction. Also through doing other investigations where we identify someone that's in possession of illicit cannabis on the road, and we determine where that source of the cannabis has come from. So there's a variety of means or ways that this will come to our attention. And as I said before, our capacity as law enforcement to aggressively and proactively enforce overproduction we're challenged. As you know, we're addressing the opioid crisis. We're trying to prepare for the legalization of cannabis. And that's where one of our challenges is how much and where we prioritize, illicit or overproduction. And that's why we're really asking for a slower approach to allow us to better address the initial aspects of legalization and then make an informed and educated decisions moving forward.
Senator Poirier.
Thank you, Chair. I have 2 questions, and it is for our the Police Association or the Vancouver. Either one can respond. We've heard over the last few weeks from different groups, specifically even the Association of the Municipalities in smaller communities, that they're wondering of the extra costs that's going to be involved for not only the firemen if they're needed to be out more because they pay a lot of them as per visit or as per call that the fireman has to go out, they're volunteer. Some of them are concerned about the extra costs of policing that may policing service to their municipalities or their areas due to the extra workload that could be needed. And some of the issues that we're hearing of as being a concern will be definitely to be able to, are we ready and do we have the manpower to monitor the driving under influence for the cannabis? Then again, we've talked about the home plants, to the illegal market, all of these things. I'm just wondering, other than the house plants, the illegal market, and the driving under the influence, when it comes to the workload added on to the police force, is there other issues out there that are main concern to the police that we should add to that could bring the workload up quite a bit and bring extra costs, maybe if they need more manpower out there, is the first question. And the second question is, you mentioned just a few minutes ago to one of my colleagues in answering the word shelf life. And I was just wondering, not knowing much about marijuana when it comes to smoking, I've never smoked it, the shelf life, what are you talking exactly? It expires? Is there a health risk once it's expired, or is it just that it's no longer good to smoke? Or what do you mean by, let's just tell us a little bit about the shelf life. What do you mean by that?
So, Senator, I'll address your first question. So we have seen, and some estimates have been approximately 2% increase to police services in the onset to manage the legalization of cannabis. And you did identify some of the key factors for us: the in-home grows, overproduction, and certainly drug-impaired driving are significant. One of the things from our lessons learned from Colorado and Washington State was that there was also a significant increase in those nuisance type of calls. You know, the neighbor calling about someone continuously smoking in their backyard, or people who are smoking in an area where they're prohibited or believed to be prohibited, i.e. near kids, school grounds, and that. So we have seen the police services in other jurisdictions have had an increased call of service for a lot of those lower, more nuisance type calls, in addition to some of the larger. Certainly for us, for the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, drug-impaired driving is a priority. It adversely affects public public safety. It's a high priority for us, as is addressing the illegal market, I'll use that term, and as is ensuring that we address the youth accessing cannabis will be our priorities as we move forward. In regards to your second question about a shelf life per se, again, there's a lot of variables. It is a plant material. It is degradable. Certainly people who store it, in a way that keeps it cool and keeps it hydrated, it can actually prolong the use. But somebody who's leaving a dried plant or the dried product, outside or in their kitchen and that, it would not have a long-term, it does start to degrade. I'll pass it to Inspector Spurn if he has more specifics on a timeline, but it really does, it's variable on heat, it's variable on the way it's stored.
Yeah, just to further.
Sorry, I'm going to need to move on. Senator Bernard.
Thank you, Chair. This question is for Mr. Bourque. You mentioned in one of your remarks that you spoke about marginalized people being impacted by home growing, and I'm wondering if you could expand on that a bit more. Are you saying that home growing would provide access to people who normally wouldn't have access? Just seeking some clarification on that, please.
Well, the one thing I spoke about, there's two vulnerable populations who would have be exposed to smoke and the health effects from fungus and molds, where growing is occurring in a shared space, a building that has a shared ventilation system. That was one. The other is that landlords would be expected to have increased costs from remediation, and this would have to be passed on to tenants. And lower income Canadians are, there's more renters amongst lower income Canadians than buyers of homes, and so they're disproportionately affected.
And how might that be for people living in social housing? Has there been any discussion in that whole social housing area?
That's a very good question. If you read the government's housing strategy, it really is a social housing strategy. They identify in considerable detail the amount of work that needs to be done to bring social housing up to speed in Canada. They've identified $4 billion, which they acknowledge will not solve the problem and will only begin to address the significant housing needs of Canadians. So there's no doubt that situation will not be made better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Lankin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And my question is to Inspector Spurn. Inspector, I have 3 minutes and 3 questions. I'm going to put them all out there and then try and leave the most of the time for you to respond. The first is with respect to your comments about increase in number of oil extraction operations. I agree that they're highly dangerous. I just wonder, given the size of the illicit market right now, what increase and why an increase, and particularly if people buy the product legally, are they not still able to use it, dried product, a bud, to turn it into oil? And might that happen no matter what? It's not. I don't understand the relationship to home grow only. The second is the issue of age of a provider. If someone provides an amount of marijuana to a teenager who is restricted from having it, although below a certain amount it's ticketable as opposed to criminal, the elder brother who buys, a small case of beer is facing a ticketable offense for doing that to give it to a minor. In this case, the person could be facing 14 years. In that kind of a family or close situation, is that reasonable, or should we be looking at some provision for that to be a ticketable offense as well? Oh, I'm sorry. There was a third one.
So I'll talk about the...
sorry, Inspector Spurn. I realize that. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
So if we talk about the oil extraction, first of all, you're not supposed to be using solvents to extract oils from these plants right now. But what we're saying is that without possession limits in the home, reasonable possession limits, it's a big moneymaker for people to sell these oils on the illicit market. So that's something we're already seeing in Vancouver as early as a week ago, where we ran into one of these, that was making a lot of oil with a lot of solvents inside an apartment. So they're going to get it anyways, yes, if they have their 30 grams, but chances are it's going to be on a much smaller scale as opposed to kilos and kilos of marijuana if you're allowed to possess without any limit in your house. As far as the an older brother giving marijuana to a sibling and facing a stiff penalty. Do you want to weigh in on this? I mean, that's a tough question.
Yeah, and I think certainly we would, our courts would have a balanced approach on how, and looking at all the circumstances and making an informed decision on how to manage that. But we do think it's very important, certainly at the onset, that we really highlight how important it is that people are not diverting cannabis to youth. We've asked for packaging on labels to identify the penalties for diverting cannabis to youth, and we know that, as I said earlier, approximately 65% of the way youth are accessing cannabis is through a friend or through a family member. So we need to ensure that this does not become a common practice, and we'd like to message that out as much as possible.
Okay, I'd like to get a question in here at the end as we wrap up. I want to get some sense of how widespread could be abuse and misuse of this 4-plant proposition. I could imagine that back in the 20s and 30s, when they were talking about lifting the prohibition on alcohol, somebody had suggested, well, we'll allow people to make alcohol in their home and have stills and make wine and all that sort of. People would have probably said a lot of similar things to what we've heard today. But I don't sense it's brought about a catastrophe. Yes, there may have been in the early stages some problems, but I don't hear very much nowadays that it's a big problem in terms of children in the home or in what it does to other tenants or nearby neighbors, that this has become an enormous problem by allowing people to make wine or to make alcohol in their homes. So how widespread, I guess? I don't sense that's widespread. I sense most people still go to the store or get it in the traditional legal way, or the way we've come to consider traditional. So just how widespread is this problem likely to be if this 4-plant allowance? So I'll start with the police, the deputy chief.
So maybe I can just comment on that. So having the unfortunate experience of drinking some of these home wines, it's not a product that is readily sold. There is not a market for homemade wines or beer, quite frankly. But the illicit marijuana market is $7 billion a year, roughly, with over 300 organized crime groups involved in it. So there is a massive illicit market right now for cannabis. And what we're trying to do, and what one of the goals of this bill is to try to bring this under a regulated scheme, which we totally support. But we need to take that slow approach in order to try to divert organized crime. And like I said, Colorado, Washington State, we're still seeing 30% of the market share by organized crime. So cannabis in the amount from a homegrown, as I said, 48 ounces, is producing more than the average person will consume. That is a very large amount than the average person would consume in a year. So there's a lot of leftover product which would be available for diversion. So because we have a strong illegal market now, because we're trying to change the culture of how people are purchasing their cannabis, and we want to push them into legal regimes, that's why we're really advocating that no personal grows at this point, and then let's revisit it once we start to get a handle on what we're addressing and dealing with the legal mechanisms that are put in place, sir.
Okay, let me ask Mr. Page. I suppose if everybody drank everything in their alcohol or liquor cabinet, they could also be in terrible shape. But Mr. Page, do you have any further comment on that? On the how widespread do you think this will be? Or will most people buy it still from the
I think it's going to be relatively small, in the sense that with alcohol, I can't remember the exact stat, but it's like 75% of adult Canadians consume alcohol, frequently or infrequently, and the number of cannabis consumers is significantly lower, so maybe 20 or 25%. I was just trying to dig it out of my phone. And we heard before 15 kilos of tobacco production for personal use is allowed, and I have never met anyone who's grown tobacco for their own use. And I think we're going to see something similar in that most people will elect, because of the quality and the convenience and the price of retail cannabis, whether it's mail order in a store, depending on the province, to do it themselves, or to buy it there, and to do it themselves will be a minority of people, as Dr. Small said, sort of horticulturally inclined people. It'll be a hobby, but it's going to be small.
Well, we've come to the end of the meeting. We're at 4 o'clock, and I do appreciate all of you for your contributions. It's been a lively discussion over 2 hours, but we managed to get everybody in to get a question, and a lot of people getting to ask a second round question as well. So thank you very much, and I declare the meeting suspended. We will resume in half an hour with a new panel. Resume this meeting of the Social Affairs, Science and Technology Committee dealing with Bill C45, an act respecting cannabis to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act and the Criminal Code and other acts. And we're focusing on home cultivation at today's meeting. This is the second panel of the day. And we have an hour and a half for this panel. And I'm pleased to welcome, first of all, here at the table, Solomon Friedman, who's a criminal defense lawyer with Edelson and Friedman. And we have also Sean Robichaud, criminal defense lawyer, Robichaud and Barristers and Solicitors. And on the video conference from out west, we have John Conroy, lawyer, and Neil Boyd, professor, Department of Criminology at Simon Fraser University. So welcome to all four of you. I'll go in the order that I have you on my schedule, and ask that you give opening comments of up to 7 minutes, please. And starting with Solomon Friedman.
Mr. Chair, Deputy Chairs, Honourable Senators, thank you for inviting me to address you today. Bill C45 purports to address important public health and criminal justice objectives, namely to end the misguided war on cannabis and its ancillary effects, and to legalize and regulate access to cannabis. Unfortunately, the bill falls well short of that mark in a few important respects. Much has been said before this and other committees with respect to the failings of Bill C45 and the Cannabis Act that it creates. For my part, there are three primary areas of concern that I wish to raise this afternoon. First, the bill will be difficult to implement and apply in practice. Too much is left to the discretion of police. Apart from the discretionary areas, many of the provisions of the new Cannabis Act are confusing and assume knowledge and expertise on the part of frontline police officers that is simply not there. There are numerous examples of this throughout the bill. Police officers are expected to differentiate between flowering and non-flowering, and budding and non-budding plants. It appears impossible at present that police will possess the requisite level of horticultural knowledge in order to objectively and fairly enforce the law. Similarly, police officers must distinguish between permissible and prohibited quantities of cannabis. Is it 30 grams or 31 grams? For a young person, is it 5 grams or 6 grams? And even more problematic, an officer must determine whether or not the cannabis in question is legal or, quote, illicit cannabis, and whether or not the individual in possession of the cannabis knows that it is illicit. These determinations will no doubt lead to a host of unintended and unjust consequences. Imagine this occurring in the course of a simple traffic stop or a casual interaction on the sidewalk. Can individuals expect to be detained while an officer determines whether or not an offense has been committed? If so, for how long? Will they be provided with their right to counsel as required by the Charter? In addition, recall that the Act authorizes the issuance of search warrants, and in some circumstances, warrantless searches with respect to alleged violations of the Cannabis Act. The courts can expect applications to be made by officers who are not themselves sure that offenses have truly been committed. We can further expect disproportionate effects on disadvantaged and racialized communities, as Cannabis Act searches and seizures are authorized and conducted where no warrant would otherwise have issued. Second, while the bill would allow for certain offenses to be prosecuted by way of ticket as opposed to formal proceedings, and for the records of such convictions to be kept separate from other judicial records, this option is only available for those with the means to pay their fine within the set time period. The Act provides that this record suspension type procedure can only be used where, quote, the accused pays the amount within the period set out in the ticket. The law, as presently framed, does not provide for any mechanism to allow an individual who is unable to pay the fine to have his or her record of a Cannabis Act conviction to also be kept separate from other judicial records. In other words, the poor need not apply. This is not only unconscionable, it is also likely unconstitutional. As a result, the indigent and the unfortunate will be saddled with permanent records simply because of their inability to pay their fines. Surely, this cannot be Parliament's intention. I recommend that the section which currently prevents imprisonment for non-payment be amended to allow for the truly impecunious to have their Cannabis Act records also held separately from other judicial records, notwithstanding their failure to pay. Third, young persons who contravene the Cannabis Act are treated more harshly than their adult counterparts. This disparity stands in stark contrast with the fundamental principles and purpose of the youth criminal justice regime, namely rehabilitation, reintegration, and fair and proportionate accountability for young persons. Notwithstanding those principles, enshrined in the Youth Criminal Justice Act, a key benefit that this bill provides to adult offenders is unavailable to similarly situated young people. I refer to the record-keeping provisions of this bill. As of now, offenses with respect to youths cannot be initiated by way of ticket. In other words, a youth could end up with a permanent criminal record for an offense that, if committed by an adult, would result in a separate, inaccessible judicial record. If, for example, the youth were to commit another offense during the record access period, the Youth Cannabis Act record would be transformed into a permanent adult criminal record. This should be amended prior to the bill becoming law. I close with this final thought. The criminal law is a blunt instrument. It is ill-suited as a tool of social policy and reform. If the purpose of this law is, as the government has repeatedly said, to end the cannabis black market and the ancillary societal and legal costs that accompany it, Bill C45 will not accomplish that. Those who would engage in the illicit trade in cannabis have not, to this point, been deterred by the host of offenses and penalties set out in the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. It is folly to assume that the Cannabis Act will be any different. In fact, the tangled mess of regulation, discretion, and confusion created by this act may very well cause people to eschew the legal market and continue relying on illicit sources of supply, thereby defeating the very purpose of this legislation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Okay. The next will be Sean Robichaud, who's criminal defense lawyer, Robichaud, Barristers, Solicitors.
Thank you, Senator Eggleton. Thank you, members of the Senate, for inviting me here today. I'm very honored to speak to you on this very important issue for all Canadians. I'm a practicing lawyer with accredited specialization in criminal justice from the Law Society. I hold my law degree from Queen's and my LLM from Osgoode with a specialization in criminal law and procedure. I've practiced exclusively in criminal law for nearly 15 years in a wide range of cases, many of which surround CDSA matters and more specifically possession, cultivation, and distribution of these controlled substances. I hope my experience and expertise will offer some insight into the practical concerns and serious reservations this legislation brings before many lawyers and legal organizations who have submissions before you and before the Parliament of Canada. Despite the vast and profound effects this legislation may have upon the criminal justice system, I am focusing my contributions to three concerns in the interest of time. One, the overbreadth and certain definitions of criminalization and youth and its asymmetrical application for minor deviances, as well as for the same effect for all Canadians. 2, the futility and risk of overly harsh punishments proportionate to the offences committed. And 3, the significant additional costs and pressure C45 will have upon an already strained judicial system. Notwithstanding this focus, I ask the committee to appreciate that this is simply done out of brevity. Other issues that the Senate may find equally of importance will be the potential for disproportionate enforcement of an unbalanced nature towards Black, Indigenous, and other racialized Canadians. 2, the lack of clear and mandatory control measures to secure marijuana dwellings, particularly in the homes of young people, which may in turn make marijuana easily accessible. And 3, the collateral effects upon Canadian immigration and emigration, particularly as it relates to criminal matters. If these ancillary issues are of any interest to the committee, I am quite willing to discuss them. Moving then to my 3 concerns. 1, the overbreadth of certain definitions and criminalization of youth for minor deviances. The deviances relating to possession, no matter how minor, are punishable by criminal prosecution, by either summary conviction or by indictment, each carrying the potential for incarceration of 6 months and 5 years, respectively. In cases of possession for the purpose of distribution, importing, cultivation, production, one may face either a summary conviction offense or an indictable offense with a potential of up to 14 years. I point this out to remind the committee that violating this act, even in a relatively small way, like an 18-year-old sharing a joint with a 17-year-old or growing an extra plant, is a very serious criminal matter, despite the characterization of C45 of having a decriminalization effect. In almost all instances, with the exception of small amounts of marijuana, that were in practice already, for all intents and purposes, not prosecuted, the sanctions are increasing than they were presently under the CDSA. As a comparison, offences presently aligned with 5-year maximums include sexual offences, certain offences against children, firearms, domestic violence. When we move to the 14-year max, we're now aligned with far more serious crimes such as terrorism offences, threats to commit nuclear devices, attack on a UN premise, arson, and very serious sexual offences against children. I'm fearful that most Canadians who hear this legislation as decriminalization are having a dangerous misunderstanding of what this means and how closely they may be walking a tightrope between lawful use and very serious criminality. I can't get into all definitions, but to use one in particular, the issue of distribution of a serious concern. With a very broad definition of distribute, there are many problems that arise, and far too many to cover. Suffice to say that the overly broad definition captures activity that Canadians will not reasonably expect. Distribute, as you all know, includes administering, giving, transferring, transporting, sending, delivering, providing, or otherwise making available in any manner, whether directly or indirectly. As an example of using otherwise making available in any manner, it's obviously very broad. While it clearly captures activity like sharing a joint, does it, for example, capture 2 parents who have marijuana in their dresser for their 17-year-old son to find? Does it include not properly securing the premises for the 4 plants? These are not far-fetched problems from a criminal defense lawyer's point of view. Given the harshness of penalties for youth distribution, which I will return to, what happens when a 16-year-old is caught at school with marijuana, selling it to friends, and says he stole it from his parents? I believe that, quote, making available will become a live issue in courts and one that will be hard fought when these hypothetical parents are facing criminal offenses carrying up to 14 years in prison. I should add, this is aggravated further by the lack of guidelines, perhaps coming from the regulations, to secure cultivation and handling akin to what we see in firearms legislation. The other aspect as it relates to youth, this, as Mr. Friedman has pointed out, there are serious concerns, particularly as it relates to the constitutionality of how youth are treated. In no other aspect of the criminal justice system are youth treated asymmetrically as it relates to criminal offenses. Similarly, there is no evidence that this effect will have a deterrent upon youth. Indeed, youth possession is criminalized under the present regime, despite marijuana being completely prohibited, and despite now ages between 15 and 24, as you know, are among the highest users of cannabis in developed countries. If a policy is to complete criminal of complete criminal prohibition of youth has failed, then clearly partial decriminalization will also. I point now to the futility and risk of overly harsh punishments for minor deviances of the legislation. My view, based upon first-hand knowledge within the justice system, is that harsh sentences do very little to deter crime. It's a view widely held among criminal law scholars and backed strongly by empirical data that deterrence of strong sentences have very little effect. Some studies have come to find that it's between 2 to 5% of people are responsible for 50% of crimes. Due to the profitability of illicit drugs, as you've already heard from today and other capacities, the prohibited markets, this means that youth are likely to turn then to markets that are governed by organized crime, which will then expose youth to far greater risks than what would otherwise be in place. Rather than, so while a harsh sentence may have a deterrent effect upon a brother who wants to pass on a joint to a sibling, it will not have an effect upon organized crime, in my view. And this is a serious concern because it then creates an entire market for the entire market for people to go after use in a way that otherwise people wouldn't be deterred. Lastly, with respect to increased costs and strains on the judicial system, it's my view that C45 will put great pressure on an already strained judicial system, notwithstanding the expressed intent of the legislation to the contrary. The costs I'm referring to are directly upon judicial resources and not upon police and enforcement, as you've already heard. The reason for this strain will be for many reasons, but will include resolution is not likely when a person feels they should not be criminalized for marijuana possession, and many will fight the charges out of principle. Conditional sentences will not be made available for most offenses. The line between law-abiding citizen and criminal is severely abrupt, as already alluded to, and hard for a person to reconcile that what they did is criminal and accept responsibility as such. For anything proceeding by way of indictment and carrying 14-year possible sentence, jury trials are available as a mode of election, and one that I expect many will seek to pursue, even facing overwhelming evidence in hope of nullification. Severe immigration consequences for non-citizens of Canada, severe immigration consequences for those traveling to the United States. All of these and many other reasons will give accused very strong incentives to fight charges, no matter how bad the evidence may be against them. Thank you.
Thank you. And now to the two who are joining us by video conference, I'd ask them to make some opening remarks. We'll start with John Conroy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the Senate. I am billed as a lawyer, and I should perhaps just add that I, too, have been a criminal defense lawyer and for 45 years, consistent with Bill C45. And, of course, in 1982, I became a constitutional lawyer once we got the charter. And throughout that whole period of time, I'm in Abbotsford, which is the Kingston of the West, surrounded by federal prisons, and have spent a considerable amount of time dealing with people in prison on this and other issues. I was called to the bar in 1972. That was the year of the cannabis report by the Ledane Commission, and I commend to you that especially all of those who say we're doing all of this in a hurry, go back and have a look at that and see what was discussed at that time, as well as all of the other royal commissions that have occurred going back to 1893. I was counsel in the Supreme Court of Canada on behalf of Mr. Kane in the Malmo-Levine-Kane challenge to prohibition that was decided in 2003. I was also counsel for Van Du in the supervised injection site case in the Supreme Court of Canada. And I was also counsel in Allard, the medical marijuana case that led to the finding of unconstitutionality of the marijuana for medical purposes regulations and led to the current access to cannabis for medical purposes regulations. I didn't realize that this panel was focused on home cultivation, so instead of, going into the detail of the two prior defense lawyers whose submissions I would adopt, I'll turn and focus a bit on that because there was extensive evidence in the Allard case on that very issue. The police and fire chiefs and so on brought old evidence from the days of when we had multiple grow ops in British Columbia here in particular, and there were problems of fire, mold, and public safety that arose in the illegal market. And once the government allowed people to grow for themselves or have somebody grow for them, first under the marijuana medical access regulations, and then tried to take it away under the marijuana for medical purposes regulations, we had people then legally growing cannabis. And this is very important because while there were all these problems during the illicit days, you would be hard-pressed to find a building inspector or a zoning inspector or people who are in government now at the local level who would want to go back to those old days, because we established quite clearly, and Justice Phelan found as a matter of fact, that all of the problems with home growing you can ameliorate them. You can take care of mold quite easily, and we had experts that testified. And so if you want to look at detailed evidence about mold, public safety, people have security cameras. They call the police if somebody tries to come. They give them the video, which they never did when they were also involved in the illegal market. And so the experience in terms of a transition from an illegal market or an illicit market or prohibition into a regulatory market occurred with the medical marijuana situation over the last 10 years, and shows that legalization brings things up, shows what the problems are, enable people to take steps to ameliorate them and fix them. And so that's the most important thing that I think we have to realize. The Cannabis Act basically has a little bit of legalization in the beginning, the 4 plants. Thank goodness they got rid of the height restriction, which would have been really complicated. So the 4 plants and the 30 grams. And so that's the basic legalization, with the provinces being allowed to do the distribution. Then you've got a little bit of decriminalization that we used to talk about in the old days, and that's the ticketing scheme. If you're a bit over the limits in terms of the legalized part, you're into ticketing scheme, which is a civil type of a penalty. And then the rest of the act, as has been well described by the previous 2 speakers, is continued criminal law, and it's problematic. The Ledane report recommended a maximum of 5 years, 45 years ago, for indictable offenses. And we are still proposing, the Cannabis Act proposes 14. I can't remember if the prior speakers mentioned this, but it was under the Conservative regime that the penalty for production was elevated from 7 years to 14. 14-year maximum is significant because back in 1972, Pierre Elliott Trudeau introduced absolute and conditional discharges to ameliorate the criminal record for possession of cannabis, and so that the records would be wiped out. You can't get an absolute or conditional discharge if there's a 14-year maximum. Similarly, many years later, the Sentencing Commission and others said we're incarcerating too many people, we need to decarcerate the nonviolent, and we created a sentencing option called the conditional sentence order. That, too, you can't get if the offense carries a maximum of 14 years and up. So if the parent growing the 4 plants who wants to talk to their young person, the 12 to 17-year-old, about cannabis and have a discussion so they don't go to the black market, they'll be committing an offense theoretically subject to a 14-year maximum. They won't be able to get a conditional sentence order. They will be facing potential imprisonment. So there are some really problematic things with that latter part of the bill, and I won't go into them in more detail because the prior 2 speakers did. So the most important thing, I should also add, I incorporated Normal Canada back in 1977. I incorporated the BC Compassion Club Society in 1997. And so I've been around people involved in cannabis and various aspects of the situation for a long period of time. And I should add that I was also part of the ad hoc committee that sent to you hopefully you've received it today, if not before, a response to the SAM submissions and documents that your committee received. And so you have that, or should have that, in detail, addressing the youth issues, the impaired driving issues, hospital visits, social justice charges and arrests, crime trends, and the opiate issue in some detail in that document, and I won't repeat it here. So the most important thing, I think, is for people who have still fears and worries about different things going to happen, is remember this is a beginning, it's a start, things can be changed over time, but most importantly, we're bringing the whole issue above ground instead of continuing to force it underground, not getting the statistics, not being able to do as much research as in the past, and bringing it up so that we can see exactly how it isn't going to be a significant problem, just as all the prior Royal Commissions and the Ledane Commission reported many years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Neil Boyd, Professor, Department of Criminology, Simon Fraser University.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak. I'm very much in agreement with the comments made by the previous three speakers. I'm going to speak perhaps a little more generally about where we are today. First, I applaud the general approach taken by the federal government, legalization of cannabis and regulation in the interest of public health. This is an approach that will increase our knowledge of both the harms and the benefits of the use of cannabis, a knowledge that has been severely limited by almost 100 years of criminal prohibition. Although the government has framed this issue as one that has the goals of restricting access for youth and dismantling the black market, it's important to recognize that this is also a human rights issue. Those who use cannabis do not deserve to be labeled as criminals today or at any point in the past. Marijuana was criminalized in 1923 with the simple declaration, there is a new drug in the schedule. There was no discussion or even knowledge of the drug at that time, and it is now clear that for most users in most circumstances, alcohol and tobacco are more toxic and more disabling with a much greater morbidity. Put differently, our criminal law was created by an ideological line drawn between the so-called good drugs of the first world, alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceuticals, and the so-called bad drugs of the developing world, cannabis, coca, and opiates. Public health was simply not a part of the legislative agenda. I should add that the Narcotic Control Act, passed in 1961, contained the most severe penalties for cannabis possession and distribution after 50 years of virtually no charges in relation to that drug. But convictions began increasing, and in 1966, more than 1,000 Canadians were convicted of simple cannabis possession, and most went to jail, some for 2 years or more. But by 1975, there were 40,000 convictions annually for possession alone, and jail was no longer a practical option. Getting tough on users had not worked. The bill before you now, Bill C45, is not without its flaws. Its approach to the distribution, and more pointedly the possession of illicit cannabis, is unduly punitive. I have difficulty in understanding the logic and practical application of Section 8 of the Cannabis Act, creation of the criminal offense of possession of illicit cannabis. With the growing of up to 4 plants permitted, how will a determination be made that a person is in possession of illicit cannabis? And more important, why would we want to treat this activity as a crime with the possibility of a maximum of 5 years imprisonment? With respect to Section 9, yes, I understand the desire to restrict trade to those who follow the rules and to ensure that the regulation of the product is in the interest of consumers and consumer safety. But the approach to cannabis throughout C45 is much more harsh and condemnatory than our approach to alcohol and tobacco. And given the relative risks to public health of each of these drugs, that does not make logical sense. I suppose on reflection that these differences are best seen or understood as part of our cultural transition as we move from criminal prohibition to tolerance. What I would ask of the Senate, notwithstanding the flaws of C45, is that they ensure that this legislation passes and receives royal assent. I recognize that some Conservative senators are seeking to advance an agenda of social conservatism without regard for the best available evidence. I urge that they reconsider the logic of their positions and consider endorsing tolerance as a principle of importance, as uncomfortable as that position might seem to them. I want to conclude by reflecting on the past decade and, given my experience with this issue, perhaps the past 40 years. In a recent research article, I and two of my graduate students wrote about a survey that we had conducted with 300 self-described cannabis users in Canada and a similar number in the UK. Like other research to date, our survey revealed a striking consistency in the three most common reasons for use: pain relief, reduction in anxiety and stress, and improved sleep. The respondents were mostly male, with an average age in their mid-30s. The overwhelming majority had experience as recreational users, but had transitioned to a conception of themselves as medical users. They talked about both the medical benefits and the pleasures that they derive from using cannabis. We should not be afraid of acknowledging that cannabis can act as a commodity that provides both pleasure and functions as a salve, a remedy for life's difficulties. As Randy Newman sang on his 1974 album, Good Old Boys, it takes a whole lot of medicine for me to pretend that I'm somebody else. And many of us know that red wine can deliver on that promise, and sometimes to our detriment. But given that context and the relative harms of each substance, there doesn't appear to be much logic in regarding cannabis as a second-class alternative. In the past decade, we have seen substantial changes in relation to cannabis. Legalization in a significant number of U.S. states, a very important increasing interest in regulation of THC and CBD levels, and improved understanding of the impacts of this drug for both its benefits and its harms. These are very positive developments that we should continue to encourage. We've begun to recognize that cannabis, properly regulated, may be a benefit to our society as a mind-active alternative to more destructive drugs such as opiates or alcohol, or simply as a means to soften the rigors of our increasingly complex modern world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I, at the beginning, described this as a panel on home cultivation, and the last panel certainly was totally home cultivation, but this one is more of a crossover one, I should have described it as, from home cultivation, which got some mention, into other legal issues, which got lots of mention. So that opens up a wide range of other issues that for us to consider, but all important issues relevant to this bill. So I thank all four of you for your initial presentation. So now, members of the committee, again, 5 minutes each. The shorter the preambles, the more the questions you can get in, and if we can keep the answers as short as possible, and that'll increase the amount of questions and answers we can get in. So let's start with Senator Seidman.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you all very much for your presentations, helping us try to understand some of the complexities of this legislation. Mr. Boyd, if I might ask you, address you first. So the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and others have pointed out that while personal possession limits are set at 30 grams, Bill C45 places no limit on the amount of marijuana a person is allowed to possess inside his or her home. So do you foresee an increase in criminal activity resulting from the combined effect of allowing home cultivation while not setting any limit on the amount of cannabis permitted for personal possession while at home?
I don't. I understand the argument that that there will be people who will use that as a reason to essentially grow in their own homes, and to much of this is going to depend on the ability to meet consumer demand. And to the extent that a place like British Columbia, where I live, has taken a position that there will be a sufficient number of retail outlets, that they will compete with the current illicit market in terms of price, I don't think that should be an issue. I mean, I think, again, it might be useful to contrast this with alcohol. It's not a concern we would have. And it's a more toxic drug. The question sort of presupposes a focus, understandably and logically, on what we have now, the illicit realm. What I'm suggesting is we're in a state of transition, and we don't know precisely how that transition will take place. But there's no reason to presume that this is going to be the kind of major issue that some have suggested.
Perhaps I might say if Mr. Friedman or Robichaud have a comment on that.
My only comment on that is that the illicit market is driven by demand and profitability, and I see that on the criminal defense side. So the idea here is that as the demand is met in the legal market, then the profitability decreases. At that point, it becomes completely irrelevant whether somebody has 30 grams, 100 grams, or a kilogram in their home. They're not a target for criminal activity because cannabis is similarly available at a legal retail outlet. That requires, obviously, cooperation on the part of the provinces. It's troubling to me that there seems to be uneven availability on the provincial level, but provided that there is a consistent level of supply on the legal market, it really makes very little difference as to how much cannabis somebody possesses inside their own home.
If I could build upon that, Senator Seidman, thank you for the question. What I would say is your question related to whether or not there'll be an increase in crime, and I see there's actually three parts to that question in a sense, because the factual occurrence of crime is different from the enforcement of crime, and then the subset of that is what crime was it and what was the intentionality of the person. So the first question would be, how will the police know about this additional amount of marijuana? The second question is it a crime? Because if that person, of course, possessed, let's say, 300 pounds of marijuana, and they could make an assertion, I won't say an argument, an assertion that it was for personal use, then we get into the third component, which is how do we go about proving that? So I don't see it statistically, if we could look at it in a vacuum, I don't see it increasing crime, but I do see, and this is part of the strain I anticipate on the criminal justice system, that if and when enforcement measures are taken and search warrants are executed, I suspect police will act and charge under the possession for the purpose sections based upon the circumstantial evidence that there was over a certain amount. Now, on the flip side, as a defense lawyer's point of view, I have a strong argument to make that, well, there's no limit, so you can't make that reasonable inference. And of course, I think what you're alluding to is, does that create better conditions for organized crime to act? And I would have to concede that it does.
Thank you. Do I have some time
Yep.
still?
Well, you've got about half a minute. So.
Okay, so, well, I'm going to try. Mr. Robichaud, you said in your presentation, you talked about the cost to the judicial system.
Yes.
And you said lengthier trials, fewer resolutions by way of guilty pleas. Could you explain that, please?
There's a lot to be said about this, but I think one analogy that we could draw is if we look back maybe 20 years or so and impaired driving never really got the stigmatization that other criminal offenses do. And so people don't see themselves as a criminal when they have 2 or 3 more drinks than they should. And I see this even on a day-to-day. It's hard for people to conceptualize that and equate themselves with a serious sex offender. And that's often the thing. I didn't kill anybody, so what's the problem? And I think what you're going to find is as people are charged with these offenses, they're going to quickly conflate that to say, well, I only passed a joint to a 17-year-old. Now, from a personal point of view, I don't think that that should be part of criminalization whatsoever. But by the definition, certainly passing that 18-year-old passing a 17-year-old to the joint is very much a criminal, and a serious one at that. And so when you combine that with other crimes, serious criminality, in my view, there's no question that people will say, out of principle, out of sentence, out of all sorts of reasons, I am fighting this tooth and nail. And I think one of the other problems you're going to find is stresses upon the judicial system, because I suspect juries will be far more inclined to acquit people on nullification basis to say, I don't agree with any of this legislation. I don't care whether he passed a joint to a 17-year-old or not. I'm acquitting. And so because of that and many other reasons, you're going to find a lot more strain.
Okay, Senatrice Petty-Clerc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask my question, if I may, of Mr. Robichaud first. Now, I heard you speak about the decriminalisation of possession, 5 grams for youth, and other witnesses have said that decriminalising possession of 5 grams for Canadian youth is the equivalent of a lot more in the hands of our young people. And in 2016, there are 55,000 offences that were reported to the police in relation to cannabis use. That's 23 charges in relation to cannabis. And you mentioned in your notes that there was a lot of pressure being brought to bear on the judicial system. So I'd like to hear your opinion about that, and whether C55 will help to lighten that burden, or rather 45.
Last name, there was an assumption to be made. I apologize, I don't speak French proficiently. But I think what your question related to is disproportionate treatment of youth as it relates to 5 grams and 30 grams as adults. Extrapolating upon that and inferring as much as I can from your question, the biggest problem with the 5 grams, and Mr. Friedman has pointed this out already, is we're criminalizing an aspect for youth that is entirely asymmetrical to adults. No other aspect in the criminal code does this, as that I'm aware of. I called an expert in youth criminal law today on this, and he's of the same view. And I hope this is answering the question, but the issue has many problems with it. From a constitutional point of view, I suspect the courts are going to step in and say that you can't treat people differently based upon age on the section, on the amount. And the other problem, which is far more troubling, is 2 parts that are far more troubling. One is that it seems to go against the legislation, both on the Youth Criminal Justice Act and the Cannabis Act, in stating that we're trying to protect youth and reintegrate them back into society, because it triggers, of course, another issue. And I'll give a practical example that I think we can all understand. Imagine a youth who is charged with 8 grams of marijuana. Let's move it up a little bit to see what would be realistic of a prosecution. Let's say they're charged with 30 grams of marijuana, and they are prosecuted by way of summary conviction. They go to Youth Criminal Justice Act. They receive nothing more than a reprimand. It's a sealed record. Great, I suppose. But then what happens is that youth, in addition to a reprimand, is placed on some conditions. That youth fails to show up to the probation officer. They're now, as an adult, in breach of their probation. That means they're within that sealed period, is essentially opened it back up, and they've obtained a permanent adult criminal record on something that an adult never could. So that alone is problematic with reintegration, employment, not to mention they'll be permanently banned into the United States into entry because of this permanent record, because of the unsealing that has come as a result of a trivial breach on the youth that never would have been an offense as an adult.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it. Okay, Senator Gold.
Thank you, Chair. Question for all, which is, what is your view on home cultivation? But the real thrust of my question is for Professor Boyd. The committee has heard a lot about the potential health consequences of cannabis use on the developing brain and all of that. But there's a social cost, of course, in criminalization. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on the extent to which C45 might help to minimize the social consequences of criminalization.
Professor Boyd, and then we'll go to anybody else who wants to get in on home cultivation.
Well, I think what we've seen in Colorado and Washington, Colorado perhaps more specifically, is a rapid reduction in the number of charges coming forward as a consequence of legalization. It's a more commercial legalization than what we're imagining in Canada. And much will depend upon whether there is an appetite to prosecute possession of illicit cannabis, for example. I would be surprised to see a lot of these cases going forward subsequent to legalization. I think that this is really a part of the act that's designed to appease those who are really very worried about the consequences of legalization, as opposed to something really practical and giving direction. You know, we want you to clamp down on possession of illicit cannabis. I really don't think that is it at all. And so I do see a tremendous benefit in moving forward with this, as you know. The comments made, particularly by the first three speakers, spoke about many limitations in the bill. I recognize that, but I want this bill to go forward. I think it's a huge change. It enables human freedom in a very fundamental way, and I do believe that the consequence will be significant reductions in criminalization of use, distribution, and production, and that's a positive. And we've learned a lot out of the last 5 to 10 years about both benefits and harms of cannabis. And it's legalization, it's opening up the debate that has given us that capacity.
Okay, Mr. Conroy.
Didn't the Senate committee of Senator Nolan, the late Senator Nolan, concluded that putting people through the criminal justice system was far more damaging to them than letting them have consume some cannabis? So I'm waiting for the day when one of these experts will do a study on the impact on the developing brain of taking somebody, arresting them, and putting them through the criminal justice system. I can assure you that the consequences are far worse than having a few puffs on a marijuana cigarette.
Okay, Senator Gould's second question was about home cultivation. I don't know if either of the two here in the room will want to say something further about that. Mr. Friedman?
You know, it's interesting when we think about the social costs of criminalization and how it relates to home cultivation. The primary social cost that I see on a daily basis is encouraging organized crime to profit off of cannabis, its current criminalization. My hope, and I think a positive in the bill with respect to home cultivation, is that that can address the issue of limited supply, at least in the short term. That is, if supply cannot meet the demand that would otherwise be going to the illicit market, perhaps home cultivation within the limits is prescribed as a starting point. I think a starting point even in shared dwelling houses, that's a concern of mine. But that might, at the very least, stop an immediate flow out to the illicit market. The greatest social cost, and I echo Mr. Conroy on that, because we all know, the three of us have all seen what happens to people when they go through the criminal justice system. We know about the effects of criminalization. We know that where a scalpel of social policy is required, the criminal law instead is a sledgehammer. But hopefully this is a first step to keep people from the black market and to keep people within the legal framework.
Robichaud, and then Mr. Conroy, very briefly.
Sure, I can add very briefly. I think my big concern, and there's a few, but one concern I have is how quickly we can move from lawful citizen into a criminal. Because when you have 4 plants, to have the skills to ensure that it's always at 4 plants and not exceeding that, especially through natural processes, one may die and people will back up and have more plants. I think it's a rather blunt instrument, and that seems to be the theme here, to say to someone you have moved immediately as a result of 1 plant. And of course, it goes without saying some of the absurdities of having 4 plants in 1 dwelling home, regardless of the size of that dwelling home. You could have a farmhouse in Sudbury, and because 3 adults live there, you're limited to 4, and yet you could have an apartment in Toronto and have 200 pounds of dried marijuana that you've purchased legally. It seems like a rather absurd way to deal with this. So there's a lot to be said, but I'll limit it to that.
And quickly, Mr. Conroy.
Did the committee know that you can grow 15 kilograms of tobacco in your home for yourself and everybody over the age of 18, and you can make as much beer, wine, and spirits in your basement if you want, and share it with your neighbors as long as you don't sell it? The evidence in Allard again was that, people were forced to do home grows because that's what the medical regulations required. There was no other source. We had to go to court to force the government to provide the research supply as a commercial supply. And then the evidence when they tried to take away the right to grow was the evidence was that the patients voted with their feet and went to the dispensaries, and that's why we had this huge increase in dispensaries. Most people don't want to grow, they want to go to a store, so that's going to be critical to this whole process.
Must move on. And next is Senator Munson.
Thank you, Chair. Just one question. I guess it's like Houston, Ottawa, we have a problem. I'm not sure. Because it's coming at us from different ways here. And Mr. Friedman, you brought up a lot of points that dealing with this issue of what can happen to young people and find themselves in prison and they shouldn't be there, and the poor and others. We talk so much around here about regulation, as if we think that Canadians know what regulation means. And Canadians don't have a clue, and sometimes I don't have a clue, because when you have these Justice Department lawyers who drafted all of this stuff up, you think they'd be progressive enough to see the 12 or 15 loopholes that you mentioned here today that would have been addressed before this was put before us. So is there any hope that with regulations and defining them, after the bill becomes law, because it will become law, and royal assent, in that period of time, that we can fix these loopholes that you talk about in regulation, because the general public will think after September or in July that, hey, here we go, it's all legal, I can do what I want. But you won't be able to do what you want because there is not that regulatory procedure in place. Others can answer this too, but...
Friedman.
Thank you very much, Senator. It's a great question. I'm sort of two minds about that. On one hand, I'm hesitant to say, kick the can down the road and let Cabinet come up with regulations that can, in some ways at least, blunt some of the effects of the Cannabis Act. The real problem here is this is criminal law. And as anyone who knows criminal law knows, anyone who's opened the criminal code knows that ignorance of the law is no defense. At the same time, that stands in tension with another basic fundamental principle of democracy, which is citizens ought to be on notice as to what conduct is legal and what conduct is illegal. And frankly, and this is a matter of public or civics education, the public has no idea what is legal and what is illegal when it comes to cannabis. In fact, today, and I'm sure Mr. Robichaud has had this exact same conversation in his office with potential clients, people say, I thought it was legal. I thought it was already legal. That was happening to me 5 years ago. That will continue to happen in any quantity. So in some way, there's a larger role for government to play here, which is instead of regulation, to have a focused campaign of public education. Because at the very least, you have to remember, you move 1 millimeter out of the regulated sphere, Senator, you say regulated, I say criminal, because the consequence is criminal. If you're not within that ticket sphere, the consequence is just criminal. Criminal record when it comes to employment, criminal record when it comes to travel and immigration. People need to be educated, because if you think the police are going to have difficulty enforcing this law, and they will, and the courts are going to have difficulty interpreting it, think about the average Joe with no legal education, with no law enforcement background, having to sift their way through, and one misstep is criminalization.
If I could just build upon that, because I think it's an important point that we can't lose sight of, is yes, criminal law is a very blunt instrument, and the bluntness of that instrument is often used against the most disadvantaged, vulnerable aspects of society, members of society. And so what we see is very technical violations as criminal defense lawyers being used disproportionately compared to others. So go back to my example of the person in Sudbury. If they have 7 plants or 18 plants, it's very common that people maybe look the other way. But if you have, let's say, 150 grams in your apartment in Toronto, then I suspect there'll be less inclination to let that slide. And that's a big concern, because a lot of what we see is people right on that fine line, and the bluntness is determined by police officers in the moment acting in ways that they feel appropriate, and that amount of discretion, in some instances, not all, but in some instances can be unfair and and very disproportionate.
Okay. Well, actually, we do have another half minute.
An answer from the West Coast there.
Sorry, I'm looking at it here. See, where are you pointing? I'm looking here.
Pointing at a screen.
Okay, Mr. Boyd or Mr. Conroy, then. Very briefly, please.
I've been trying to get rid of prohibition for, as I said, about a better part of 45 years, and everybody said, you're trying to talk yourself out of a business, Conroy. Well, I found that trying to educate people about legalization is even more difficult than telling them about prohibition, because here in BC, there's been so many people who have been doing things, and now they have to realize that they're going to be subject to the law. So I think that we will be able to fix some of these problems with the regulations, but some of the stuff that's in the Act is going to have to be amended. But I'm with Professor Boyd and the others. We need to pass this as the way forward, and then we can try to fix up the problems.
Okay, moving on to Senator Poirier.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here. Actually, my question, the first one I was going to have, is along the line exactly that we've just been discussing, because from what I've been hearing out in the community when we're hearing it, is we seem to have heard a lot about the risk, health risk for young youth under a certain age, and the need for more education on that end. But there seems to be maybe a need for more education on the consequence of the law. And we're seeing it because a lot of the people that are out there this is not just the youth as much as the adults, if I'm hearing them saying, no, there's no problem with driving it and there's no risk. This is just going to make everything legal that I'm already doing, whether it's growing it, whether it's smoking it in places where they shouldn't, whether it's driving or whatever. So I totally understand what you're saying, because I'm hearing the same thing out there when I'm going. But I want to go, my other question that I want to go to is on the homegrown. And I'm hoping somebody can give us a little bit of clarification on it. In past witnesses that we've had a little while back, we have already heard and we know that on the homegrown and some of the certain decisions of age-wise has been set. The provincial governments have the right to basically set the limits. But we've also seen and heard that the province of Quebec and I think Manitoba have already passed legislation that the plants will not be allowed in their provinces to be grown. And we've also heard, if I remember, I think it was the city of Richmond, BC, where they have taken a position where marijuana will not be legal within their jurisdiction of the municipality. And because of that, we're also hearing that from other witnesses that there could be a potential of court challenges coming up because of that. I just want to know if you could give me your point of view on that, and anyone can answer.
Okay. Who wants to start? Okay, Mr. Friedman?
Sure. That engages a different part of the Constitution than criminal lawyers usually work with, namely not the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but the Constitution Act. What we have here is cannabis, which is regulated, at least in this sphere, has been in the past regulated among other heads, but under the criminal law. It's interesting because the Cannabis Act doesn't actually legalize marijuana in that sense. It actually simply provides for offenses and other penalties. So there's no doubt that if municipalities or provinces attempted to quote-unquote criminalize it, they can't criminalize it because they can't create criminal offenses, that would lead to endless constitutional challenges. But one of the reasons that happens is the way the law is presently framed is, notwithstanding the purposive statements that talk about the purpose of it being to legalize and regulate, the purpose is actually just to prohibit, but only to prohibit certain areas. That's the type of thing that could have been addressed by drafting the law differently, by drafting the law to make it clear that the substance is legal and then building upon that. By taking the prohibitionist view of the legislation, and it's what we have here, and it ought to pass because it's better than what we have now, yeah, it absolutely opens the door for those types of conflicts and challenges.
Okay, anyone else on the video screen? Mr. Boyd.
Yeah, I would just add that the risk of not allowing any kind of home growing is that you may create an incentive for a black market. I'm not sure that's too likely, given the kinds of comments that we've heard to date, that most people will prefer to purchase, and if the price is set at a reasonable level, that's not going to be an issue. We're we're going to have a problem. I mean, Richmond, as you point out, has decided they're not going to have retail sales. That's not, in the context of the Lower Mainland in British Columbia, that's not going to create huge incentives for a black market because, all of the bordering jurisdictions, there will be access and there won't be any criminalization of possession of licit cannabis within Richmond. They've just decided they don't want to have any retail outlets. And municipalities have that right. It's a land use issue, and they can, and we're going to see something of a patchwork quilt. A bit like alcohol, wet and dry. We're back to that kind of a regime, and it's just going to take time, and this will sort itself out.
And there will be some constitutional challenges.
Yeah, I would think so.
Okay, anybody else on this? All right, I think that's pretty much the end of your time. Thank you very much. Senator Rain.
Thank you. I'd like to start with a question for all of our witnesses. Excuse me. We want to do our best to prevent access by young people knowing the impact on their developing brain, and also to prevent the promotion of cannabis to young people. What would you propose?
Okay, who wants to start on that? Oh, Mr. Conroy looks ready to go.
The first thing that I would propose is that you read the recent article that came out last week. It was referred to by witnesses Emily Jenkins and Jenna Valeriani last Wednesday before you, that showed that the stuff about the developing brain was overstated, and that after short periods of abstinence they could find no problems in terms of cognitive deficits. So you put brain and young person or child together, it's an emotional term and lots of people are upset about it. But if you go back and look at the fact that we've had people using cannabis at various ages for as long as I've been practicing, I say, where are the bodies? Where are the problems? We're finding out that from legalization, we are now getting to some people coming forward and finding out some statistics. About 2% of the youth was the study that I read that are having problems. So it's not a huge problem that it's being made out to be. And I think that one should consider we move forward and we are going to find out. We know there's not going to be any huge problems, but we may find out that there are certain more vulnerable groups. I mean, people who have a history of schizophrenia in their family and stuff like that, whatever age they are, shouldn't be consuming cannabis. So people need to be educated. Education about what this substance does and how it can affect different people different ways has got to be one of the most important things as we go forward so that we limit any particular problems for everybody.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that question? Yes, Mr. Robichaud.
For the question, I think it's an excellent one because, as this panel has already heard from other doctors, Dr. Meldon and Dr. Kahan, there clearly are, at least from their medical opinion, issues relating to the developing mind. But I asked the Senate to reflect back upon that, and the sentiment there, as I remember, was that you're not going to be able to eliminate an underground market. And what I would say, injecting the legal aspect into that and dealing with youth who come before the criminal justice system, is we have to be very, very careful that we do not allow youth to identify as criminals. This is such an important part and recognized within the Youth Criminal Justice Act, because once a youth identifies as a criminal, it's very hard to undo that. To use a very Canadian example, a young hockey player is always a hockey player, and one can't, even 20 years later down the road, you're still going to identify. So to answer your question, I think more steps need to be taken to ensure that youth are just never put into the criminal justice system. And ironically, that's how we're going to protect them, because the underground markets are going to get to them, and they need to be able to equip to deal with that, or we need to cut out the legs of the underground market to say there's no profitability in it. Because my concern as a criminal defense lawyer is that these harsh sentences are simply not going to deter organized crime, and they are going to go after youth because that is now their market. And combine all of those factors, I think we're working against both the Cannabis Act as well as the Youth Criminal Justice Act in protecting youth.
Okay, Mr. Friedman.
to build on what Mr. Robichaud said, and I agree completely, but to me it's sort of counterintuitive in the sense that if the medical evidence does support an increased risk with respect to youth, and I understand there's a debate in that regard, the criminalization comes at the wrong end. In other words, we recognize as a basic principle in criminal justice that youth have diminished responsibility, they have diminished maturity, they have a diminished capacity, so we tend to punish them less severely. But instead of only focusing on the adult side, we've also created a host of new penalties and new prohibitions with respect to young people. The young people, if even accepting that argument, they're the victims here. So it's as if we're punishing the victims for something that is an inherent vulnerability, that is their age and immaturity. So my proposal would be to combine education and research can only happen openly post-legalization in a real meaningful way, with a focus on those individuals who would be distributing to young people, not on the young people themselves, not giving them that stigma. I agree completely with Mr. Robichaud that if people are labeled as criminals and if they have experience in the criminal justice system, that becomes a comfortable and a familiar environment for them. And the very last place we want our young people to be in is the criminal justice system.
Okay, follow up.
I'm
sorry, Senator. I haven't got time for a follow-up. I'll put you down for the second round, though. Okay, Senator Ahmedvar.
Thank you, Chair. I'll make my questions very quick because I want to get two questions in. And my first question is to Mr. Robichaud. You spoke in your brief about the severe immigration consequences for non-citizens of Canada. Could you describe what they are and what the remedies could be?
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think one that has been overlooked greatly, although recently in news it has come up with Minister Goodall addressing that in certain capacities, but it clearly is not an understanding or agreement from what I can see with different jurisdictions. And although I can only speak anecdotally because I'm not a U.S. immigration lawyer, as I understand it, any conviction and any admission that one has used any type of illicit substance, particularly cannabis, could deem them inadmissible into the United States permanently. And so I may be wrong about that, but that is certainly a concern that has come back across my desk as a criminal defense lawyer in working with U.S. immigration lawyers, that people are barred inadmissible. And that also raises other concerns because the question then becomes who has access to this information. And as Mr. Freeman has indicated, the ticketable aspects, that may or may not be accessible under Section 51, is it? And that too raises concern. So I think a lot of foresight needs to be put into how this is going to play out for immigration or emigration from Canada. With respect to immigration, if that was what you're asking, yes, then this does have long-term effects. I'm not an immigration lawyer, but what I know is that if people are facing certain offenses, it will deem them inadmissible into Canada and make them deportable, regardless of the sentence that they actually face. So as best as I can recall, if one is eligible for a sentence to serve in the higher range of the 14 years, they're deemed inadmissible into Canada with only an appeal on humanitarian grounds for staying here. So that means, for example, the 18-year-old person who's come to Canada as a refugee who passes a joint to a 17-year-old would be deemed inadmissible with no right of appeal, well, an appeal subject to humanitarian grounds. That last aspect I'm not entirely sure of, but undoubtedly there are major immigration consequences.
Thank you. Perhaps we can get back to this later, but my second question is to Mr. Conroy and Mr. Boyd in Vancouver. We heard very compelling testimony last week from a young person who talked about her fears of social sharing and the harsh penalties associated with a 19-year-old sharing a joint with a 17-year-old. I wonder if we can learn something from the sexual consent legislation, which says that a 14 to a 15-year-old can engage in sexual activities with someone older than themselves as long as that person is less than 5 years older than him or her, and as long as there is not a relationship of trust, authority, or dependency. Is there something to learn from this?
There may be a little something to learn, but I'm not sure it's a great analogy, sexual assault. I think more of the era in which I was raised, where the penalties related to underage drinking. And, so an analogy between sexual assault and social sharing it makes more sense in the context of alcohol or another substance of that kind than in the context of that age difference. So I would agree that if you're talking about a 40-year-old and a 16-year-old with cannabis, it's not the same kind of element as with sexuality, but there's something of a correlation there.
Just to be clear, we were talking about sexual consent, not sexual assault.
Yeah, I know, but yeah.
My view is that the flaw in the bill is that there's no source for the 12 to 17-year-olds, so you're forcing them to go to a black market because, as Bill Blair explained to the committee, it's the provinces that are then passing legislation. BC recently has proposed that they will have a minor in possession offense with a penalty of up to $2,000. So you're driving it underground. You should have an amendment whereby a parent or a guardian or an adult with the written consent of a parent or a guardian should be able to supply the 12 to 17-year-olds so they don't go to the black market, so that you are looking at Youth Criminal Justice Act principles and saying, we want to have a conversation, the parents and the guardians, about this. We don't want you to go to the black market. We want you to have a way of learning about this that way and not through the criminal justice system.
Okay. Moving on to Senator Lankin.
Thank you very much. And my questions are directed to Professor Boyd, but Mr. Conroy or anyone else, if you wanted to respond. A thought came to my mind as I was listening to you about the issue of home grow and the likelihood of people wanting to actually grow their own, and you're saying you don't think it'll be a lot. And one of the problems we have, of course, is none of us know. I think we're taking a big leap here, and your recommendation is, do as much as you can to make this a public health and approach as opposed to a prohibition approach. I'm interested in the likelihood of people wanting to grow, and these two examples come from BC, and I'm sorry, this is anecdotal. That's not the best evidence, but we don't have a lot of evidence. But I know two people who, in the early days of medical marijuana, got their certification to receive it, whatever the language is, and then also a license to grow. And it was up, both of these people, it was up to 10 plants. I don't know if that's standard or if there were other amounts, but they both had ability to grow up to 10 plants. Both of them, within the course of a year or so, gave up that and didn't renew that license and didn't grow. And one of the reasons was the proliferation of dispensaries, where they could just go and buy it, where they had more choice, for the product that they wanted, for the reason that they wanted it, and that's the illicit market. But that gave them some ease of access that made those two people at least abandon the grow operations that they had of only 10 plants. Did you see other examples of that, and or does that figure into your assumptions that this won't be a really popular option for people? I should preface this by saying I now live in Northern Ontario, and as I travel to different communities in Northern Ontario talking about this, mainly rural communities, most people are aghast that it would be 4 plants because they grow more than that now. Not usually in their house, usually outside. It's a northern environment, so it's a summer activity there. But in any event, I'm interested in these 10 plants.
I think one of the keys is to think about it in terms of what's available. We know, for example, with alcohol, very few of us would want to make our own wine. We can't produce the quality that's available at a relatively inexpensive price in a liquor store. And the dispensaries are proving much the same point with respect to cannabis. They have a wide number of strains with varying CBD and THC levels, something we didn't even talk about 5 to 10 years ago. And And so I think most people aren't going to want to go down that road, provided that the price is reasonable. And we have to remember that in terms of price per unit, alcohol, a legal drug, is much more expensive than cannabis, an illegal drug. So, I'm not sure that we have to be all that worried about that kind of issue, and I would grant that it's going to vary to some extent depending on where one lives. In Vancouver, where we come from, it's a very different environment, and it wouldn't make sense for most people who use either recreationally or medicinally or some combination of the two to start to grow. It would be counterproductive for many.
The 10 grams that you mentioned would mean that those people were approved. Their dosage was 1 to 3 grams. 1 to 3 grams a day would give you ability to grow 10 plants. Okay, so that's the lowest, usually the lowest dosage, and there are many medical patients that have far greater dosages. In fact, there were 38,000 at the time of March of 2014 when the injunction was obtained, and I understand there's over 200,000 people now who have medical permits to grow and possess. But as I said, the evidence in Allard indicated that when the government MMPR process wasn't working and getting the medicine to the patients, they voted with their feet and went to the dispensaries. So I agree with Professor Boyd that most people don't want to grow. It costs money to grow. It's complicated. Here in BC, I mean, there's a huge industry that grew up. In the early days, the stuff came up by boatloads from Thailand and Colombia and so on, and then BC became an export economy. People were growing it in basements under lights, and there's all this technology and everything that's developed in order to make it safe and so on and so forth. Even engineered solutions, the bloom box where you put everything in and everything's taken care of. You will have some people doing that, and you've got some people who are, really very, very anxious to be able to do that and so on. But I think, like with alcohol, like with tobacco, most people won't, and most people, hopefully, if we have a good retail developed market, we should be okay. I should quickly add, though, that the person that you're talking about, if they were going to the dispensary because they didn't want to grow, and you say they're getting into the illegal market, if the dispensary was one that made sure they had a medical card, which you say they had, then arguably all that dispensary is doing is filling the gap that the government has failed to provide in providing reasonable access, which the courts ruled back in 2001 the government had to do in the Parker case.
Thank you. Senator Bernard.
Oh, thank you, Chair. One of my questions has already been asked and answered, so I was just developing another question. And that's in regard to Mr. Robichaud. I think one of the points that you wasn't able to discuss earlier, the potential for disproportionate enforcement towards Black, Indigenous, and other racialized Canadians. And of course, we know that, I don't know if there's time, if you can elaborate a bit on that. Then I'd like to know your opinion on your perspective on whether or not pardons should be granted for those who have been criminalized for simple possession.
Yes. So I'll answer the latter question first, because unquestionably, yes, if we're going to decriminalize this, stigmatizing people and criminalizing them needs to be dealt with very abruptly, and I believe that there's some talk about that once this legislation passes, and I hope it does. But that, I think, needs to be treated as a priority, because right now many Canadians are prevented from lawful employment and are stigmatized based on nothing more than something that will soon be legal. With respect to the more complicated question, and equally important, is that, yes, I do feel that this will be used disproportionately. There was an article that came out quite recently from Vice magazine that went through statistically some of the disproportionate application of charges. To use one specific statistic, in 2015, an Ontario student drug survey, 39% of people who used were white, 14% were Black. Police data from 2003 to 13, 33.8% of marijuana charges were against Black people. that's a problem, and it comes back to what I was just indicating, and that is the criminal justice system is a blunt instrument, and it's a blunt instrument that's used most disproportionately against certain groups. I'm fearful that little discretion will be employed when it comes to people who are black, people who are indigenous, other racialized people. I have a very serious concern about that, and we've seen this firsthand. I've seen this firsthand as a criminal defense lawyer in the application and use of provincial offenses such as the Trespass to Property Act and other acts where they're used as a step up into a broader criminal investigation and giving a lot of the sweeping powers that come from the Cannabis Act. I'm very concerned that this can be abused. And I think there is no quick solution to that, of course. It's a big problem in every aspect, but I think that's something that can't be lost upon this legislation.
Senator, Mr. Conroy is signaling that he'd like to comment. Is that okay with you?
Oh, yes.
Mr. Conroy.
In San Francisco, apparently they are doing all kinds of very progressive things to address that very issue. And in terms of funds that are going to be applied into the communities that have been most affected and so on. So, I think the government needs to look at that. Certainly in terms of the pardon question, my view is that you need to bring everybody in, not exclude them. If you want to, we know who they are. We can check out their backgrounds. We can keep a track of them. It's much easier to enforce under civil administrative rules than under the criminal law. You force them out, they're potentially competing with you in the black market. We mustn't forget that racism was the basis for the Opium Narcotic Act in 1908 in order to get rid of the Chinese people because of the opium dens and the claims for loss of profits after the riots. As Mr. Boyd has said, there was no problem with cannabis in 1923 when we added to it, but in 1972, when the charges went from 800 the previous year to 10,000, we hybridized the offenses because white middle-class kids were getting busted, and we couldn't have that going on. So there's a whole racial element to this whole thing, and if you study many of the other drugs, you'll find the same thing. So it's a very important thing in my submission that we address the problems that have been disproportionately caused to the Indigenous communities throughout Canada as a result, and that may still occur in the future based on some of the provisions of the bill.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Friedman has a comment on this as well, okay?
Yeah, just to build on what both Mr. Conroy and Mr. Robichaud said, one of the fundamental problems with the ticketing scheme is that it's exclusively at the discretion of the peace officer making the arrest. We know that there are almost countless police forces across this country with different policies and different ways about, doing their business. Some are better when it comes to policing racialized, minority, disadvantaged groups. Others are decidedly less so. My proposal would be that if there is going to be this ticketing mechanism, that it be mandatory, not discretionary. Otherwise, you leave it into the minds of that individual police officer. What kind of day is he having? What kind of interaction has he had with this person? Is it someone that he's dubbed a suspicious person? Is it someone that he wants to leave this record on? What's the mechanism of appeal for that? The answer is nothing. It's up to the discretion of the police officer, and we tend to know, and maybe because criminal defense lawyers are a cynical bunch, or maybe it's because of the work that we do, that discretion is ultimately abused. And we can imagine a scenario where peace officers who are policing well-off or whiter neighborhoods use that discretion every single day. But when they want to stop and frisk, or they want an excuse to get into someone's backpack or their trunk, that when a Cannabis Act charge is laid, they put away the ticket option and it goes right to the laying of an information.
Okay, I'd like to get a question in before round two. One of the most disturbing things that we've learned in this testimony today, we've heard a bit of it before, but particularly today, is that we could still be criminalizing young people out there. I mean, one of the objectives of this bill is to stop criminalizing our young people. And yet there are some circumstances, you start to lay them out in some of the comments you've made where they could end up as part of the criminal justice system. And I understand that the government is trying to come down hard on the illicit market, the older person who sells to a younger person and or gives cannabis to a younger person. They want to deal with that more harshly. 14 years seems like quite an extreme. Certainly if we were talking, because the two gentlemen in Vancouver keep drawing the comparisons with alcohol. You know, if an older person gave a kid a rum and coke, he wouldn't be getting 14 years in jail for that, or even a bottle of whiskey. So there's absolutely no comparison in terms of the kind of penalties as far as I can see. But here we're talking about some very severe things. So how do we, I can't imagine, for example, if a 19-year-old was sharing a weed with a friend who is 17, that 19-year-old's going to, that any court, any judge is going to sentence that person to a prison term. But how do we even this out and prevent the continuing criminalization of our youth? Okay, Mr. Friedman, then Mr. Well, we'll get the whole round of it, and then there won't be a second round at all.
I'm sure that my colleagues have very valuable contributions to make, so I'll just give one thought. And if we keep talking about this analogy with alcohol, I note that the Liquor License Act of Ontario actually provides for a specific exemption for parents to give young people under the age of 19 alcohol within a private place or a residence. That's not an offense at all. It's actually specifically mandated. So there's no reason why similar exemptions couldn't be carved out to both stop criminalizing what is really not criminal behavior and to keep youths from going to the illicit market. And I'll let my colleagues can certainly address other aspects of that question. But if we're looking at the liquor analogy, let's look at what the provinces do. And they deal with this exact question without criminalizing either the adult or the youth.
Okay, Mr. Robichaud, and then I'll go to Mr. Conroy, and Professor.
Thank you, Senator. I'll be brief because I know my colleagues have a lot to say about this. I too share the concerns, and the concerns it seems that you have as well. This legislation is setting up youth for failure, and in a very profound way, in my view. And I think that we really need to take a look at the long-term and practical effects that this is going to have upon youth. And I think we need to do everything to decriminalize for them and educate them, because you know what Mr. Freeman's alluding to is that there's a certain sensibility to that act that we would rather have our youth in our homes if we know they're going to drink, to be under supervision and to educate them on responsible drinking, because we all know, and certainly the statistics support this, because youth are at an all-time high in the developed world, in Canada, of usage. It's going to happen. So the question is, do we want that to happen, buying their marijuana from an underground market, smoking it at a park, and then driving home? Or do we want to have parents involved in that so that we can take a responsible approach? And I think this legislation fails in that specific regard and a broader regard that we've already discussed.
Okay, final words from Mr. Conroy and Professor Boyd.
Did you know that it's under the Tobacco Act, tobacco being our #1 killer, a parent or person, it's only an offense to supply a young person in public with tobacco. So you've got that exemption in terms of the Tobacco Act. You've got the exemption just mentioned a minute ago in terms of alcohol. And so I think those are very important. We need to remember that there's no lethal dose for cannabis. Certainly people can get sick, but there's no lethal dose. So we need to learn from those past legislation and provisions in order to do what the previous witnesses and the questioner indicated.
Yeah, I think all of us have been saying that there's too much criminalization in this bill. And I think it was an attempt by the government to go down a road that would curry favor with a range of perspectives, politically left and right. And I think they overdid it with criminalization. At the same time, if this bill is to falter, if it was not to get royal assent, it seems to me that might mean that we would never get any kind of legalization of cannabis. We have to hope that the over-criminalization that is represented in this bill will be amended by further changes, by either regulation or by amendments to the Act itself.
Well, we just might do that. You never know.
This isn't the first time we've come up with a brink.
We've got 4 minutes left. I have 2 people down for the second round. I would suggest that Senator Seidman and Senator Rain just pose a question, no preamble, but pose a question. I'll take both your questions, and then we'll take the answers after both your questions are on the table.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Robichaud, so you have said that the police will be more willing to write tickets for teenage marijuana possession than they would have been to like criminal charges. And as a result, in the process of legalization, what in fact is going to happen is far more charges will be laid and prosecutors will be more inclined to seek convictions. If you could help me understand that.
Just hold on. Let me get Senator Rain's question and then I'll get the answers.
Well, my question really would be...
to who?
To, I guess, Mr. Robichaud.
Okay.
Just what amendment would you propose that would deal with this issue of the problem with the youth?
Okay. So we've got two questions, and Mr. Robichaud, they're to you.
So with respect to the ticketing, as I understand the legislation, it does not actually allow youth to be ticketed. When it's over 5 grams, it automatically triggers the criminalization and the whole process that goes with that, which comes to your question, Senator Rain, and that is, I think we need to really reevaluate what it means to be labeled a criminal as a youth and be prosecuted under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. At a very minimum, to reach asymmetry and an inevitable and successful constitutional challenge, it needs to be raised to 30 grams. But I think we want to put serious consideration into broadening that and recognizing all the very important principles within the Youth Criminal Justice Act and even the purpose of this legislation, that this is not to, as Mr. Freeman has put it, victimize the victims. We need to do other things to keep them out of the system, and whether that's by increasing the minimums or doing better education. I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but the answer is not to criminalize them for something less than their adult counterparts and to then permanently stigmatize them for slight deviations later on. I think that's a really dangerous road.
Mr. Friedman, and then I'll go to the video.
Yeah, there's a very simple amendment that can be made to this legislation, and that is under Section 51 to change the wording from an individual who is 18 years of age or older to simply to any person. And all of a sudden then youth fall within that, and if the ticketing regime is to have any benefit, the youths can have the benefit of that. They can have the benefit of having no record or a record held separately from other judicial records. But right now, to me, and when I've read this, and I've read this legislation a number of times, and the legislative summaries and the commentaries, I cannot for the life of me understand what the possible argument is to deny youths access to the ticketing regime. It simply makes no sense.
And Mr. Conroy and Professor Boyd?
I agree with the previous two speakers, and I'm delighted to hear that there is a section in the Ontario legislation that we could use to put in the Cannabis Act in terms of the role of parents and guardians in relation to alcohol, and I've told you already in terms of tobacco. So I think that's the way we have to go. You had a witness last week, again, Mr. O'Soup from Saskatchewan and the Indigenous community, who expressed severe concerns about ticketing and so on going on in that community. And so, again, you can buy as much booze as you want in the liquor store and take it home. You don't have to lock it up on the way home, and you don't have to keep it in a locked box at home, and the same with tobacco. So given my experience over all these years with people in the cannabis industry, frankly, I think the 30 grams and even the 150 grams in the medical model is frankly ridiculous. But I appreciate that unlike us criminal defense lawyers or those of us who have had experience in the criminal justice system and who still think, I say naively, that heavy penalties and so on are actually going to work, that's what we have to overcome, is to realize for tobacco it's 1 to 2 year max. The same with alcohol, and Ledane recommended a 5-year max. So we're over the top, and we're going to cause problems if we enforce it. I like Professor Boyd. I think a lot of it is smoke and mirrors in order to make sure the bill gets through. This is the 4th or 5th time we've come up to the brink of passing legislation that would ameliorate cannabis laws.
Final word, Professor Boyd.
I think the point made by Mr. Robichaud is a very important one. It's the approach taken is entirely inconsistent with the Youth Criminal Justice Act. That's been a very important piece of legislation, and this approach is very much at odds with that legislation.
Well, thank you very much to all 4 of you for for giving us all your thoughts about it. It's been most helpful. And with that, committee members, we've come to the end of this meeting. And we're back again Wednesday. Pardon? Wednesday at 3 o'clock, an earlier time for our meeting on Wednesday. And with that, I adjourn this meeting.